It began in the dark, long before anyone understood what was unfolding across the Ardennes. Lanzerath Ridge was not a city. It was not a fortress. It was a thin rise of ground overlooking a quiet Belgian village, the kind of place most maps barely acknowledged. A handful of houses, narrow roads, snow-covered fields stretching out beneath a gray winter sky. To most planners, it was a footnote. To the men who would fight there, it became everything. In the early hours of December, the ridge sat wrapped in cold and silence. Snow rested untouched along fence lines and rooftops. The forest beyond stood motionless, branches heavy, sounds swallowed by winter. Visibility was poor. The world felt closed in, as if nothing beyond the immediate ground truly existed. It was the kind of quiet that makes soldiers uneasy, not peaceful, but expectant. This was the northern edge of what the Germans believed would be a decisive breakthrough. The Ardennes Offensive depended on speed. It depended on surprise. It depended on roads staying open and resistance collapsing quickly. And along one of those critical approaches stood Lanzerath Ridge, overlooking a route that German infantry needed to clear before armor could move freely. Holding that ridge was not supposed to matter, but war rarely follows intention. A small American unit occupied the high ground, outnumbered, lightly equipped, and isolated. They were not positioned for a grandstand. They were there to observe, to delay if necessary, and to withdraw when ordered. Their field of view stretched across snow-covered ground that looked deceptively open, broken only by shallow folds in the land and the dark line of forest where danger waited unseen. As dawn approached, movement stirred in the trees. German paratroopers emerged from the forest in disciplined waves, advancing carefully, weapons ready, confident in their numbers and preparation. They expected resistance, but not much, certainly not from a force so small, so exposed, so far from support. The first shots shattered the illusion. Gunfire cracked across the ridge, sharp and sudden, echoing through the cold air. The Americans held their fire until the enemy was close enough to matter. When they opened up, the effect was immediate. German troops dropped into the snow. Advance stalled. Confusion rippled through the attacking force. What followed was not a quick clash. It was a grinding, relentless fight that lasted hour after hour. German assaults came again and again, pressing forward under covering fire, trying to overwhelm the ridge through sheer force. Mortars exploded in white plumes. Machine guns raked the slope. Snow churned into mud and blood. The Americans held their positions, shifting fire, conserving ammunition, communicating quietly. Knowing that every minute mattered, they were cut off. They were surrounded. They were outnumbered many times over. And still, they held. Lanzerath Ridge became a place where time slowed unnaturally. Each attack blurred into the next. Fingers numbed, weapons overheated and then froze. Wounded men stayed in position because leaving meant weakening the line. The defenders understood something instinctively. They were not fighting to win the battle. They were fighting to delay the war. And that delay mattered more than anyone realized at the time. For an entire day, German forces were held in place by a unit that should not have been able to stop them. Roads remained blocked, timetables slipped, momentum bled away in minutes and hours that could never be recovered. While larger formations elsewhere reeled from surprise, Lanzerath Ridge quietly absorbed pressure that should have surged forward. When the fighting finally ended, it did not end in triumph. Ammunition was gone. Resistance was exhausted. The defenders were captured after holding far longer than doctrine or expectation allowed. The ridge fell, but only after it had done irreversible damage to the offensive schedule. The Germans moved on, but something had changed. The delay at Lanzerath Ridge echoed outward. Units farther west felt it without knowing why. Reinforcements arrived just in time. Defensive lines stiffened. Opportunities narrowed. What had been planned as a rapid breakthrough began to feel heavy, slow, uncertain. Lanzerath Ridge did not become famous immediately. There were no headlines, no dramatic speeches, no instant recognition. Its importance emerged only later, when historians traced the offensive backward and realized how fragile its opening hours truly were, and how a small stand on a snowy ridge had quietly altered the flow of events. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge is not about size or spectacle. It is about discipline under pressure, about holding when retreat would have been understandable, about the power of delay in a war obsessed with speed. It reminds us that history often turns not on sweeping maneuvers, but on moments where a few people decide to stay where they are, even when everything says they should be gone. Tonight, we return to that ridge, to the frozen ground where time was bought at enormous cost, to the quiet stand that shaped the opening of the Battle of the Bulge without ever asking for recognition, to Lanzerath, where a single day mattered more than anyone could see at the time. Before we continue, I want to bring you into this moment as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time has found you there? Is it late and still, or is the day just beginning to slow? If listening to moments like Lanzerath Ridge reminds you that even the smallest stands can matter deeply, consider subscribing, not for spectacle, but for the quiet stories that prove endurance often speaks louder than victory. Settle in. This is where the Ardennes truly began to resist. December 15th, 1944. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck Jr. stands in the doorway of a Belgian cafe, watching his men settle into positions that smell of stale beer and cold stone. He's 20 years old, commissioned less than a year ago, and the village of Lanzerath stretches before him like a watercolor painting. Snow-dusted roofs, a white church steeple, forests rising dark against a gray winter sky. His intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, 18 men total, has just been ordered to establish an observation post overlooking the crossroads that connects this forgotten corner of Belgium to the German border, 3 miles east. The assignment feels like a gift, after the brutal fighting in the Hürtgen forest to the north, where the 99th Infantry Division lost hundreds of men to achieve yards of muddy ground. Lanzerath represents something almost miraculous: quiet. The Ardennes sector has earned a reputation as the safest posting on the Western Front, a place where divisions go to rest and green troops go to learn the rhythms of war without dying in the process. The 99th Division, nicknamed the Battle Babies because most of its soldiers are barely old enough to vote, arrived in Europe only in November, and Lanzerath is supposed to be their classroom. 4 American divisions hold an 80-mile stretch of front here, a deployment so thin that peacetime Army doctrine would consider it military malpractice. But the generals aren't worried. The terrain itself seems to argue against attack: dense forests, steep ravines, narrow roads that turn to mud in winter. Hardly the ground you'd choose for a mechanized offensive. Intelligence reports from late November mentioned increased German activity across the border, trucks moving at night, radio silence from units that should be chattering, but these warnings disappeared into the great machinery of Allied confidence like whispers in a windstorm. Bouck's platoon represents the cutting edge of American tactical intelligence, specially trained soldiers equipped with radios, binoculars, and the kind of initiative that makes conventional infantry commanders nervous. They're supposed to watch, report, and survive, not fight pitched battles. As they move into 3 houses and the cafe that will serve as their command post, the men joke about their luck. Private First Class Risto Milosevic, a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania, sets up the 50 caliber machine gun in a second-floor window and calls down that he can see all the way to the German border. Sergeant Slape, the platoon's steady anchor at 23 years old, organizes ammunition and rations with the careful attention of a man who's read too many after-action reports from units that got complacent. The average age of Bouck's platoon is 19. Most have never fired their weapons at another human being. The village itself consists of fewer than 200 souls, Belgian farmers who've watched armies march through their fields for generations. They eye the young Americans with weary hospitality, offering ersatz coffee and warnings in French-accented English about the Germans just over the ridge. The locals know something the American High Command seems to have forgotten. Lanzerath sits at the convergence of roads that lead northwest toward Losheimer Graben, and from there to the road network that could take an army all the way to the Meuse River and beyond. In the geometry of invasion, Lanzerath is a hinge, insignificant until someone tries to open the door. Bouck studies his maps by lamplight, tracing the thin red lines that mark American positions, noting the vast spaces between units, the exposed flanks, the assumption of safety built into every deployment decision. December 16th begins 3.5 hours before dawn. At 0330 hours, Bouck wakes to a sound that doesn't belong in a quiet sector, distant thunder that goes on too long, a rolling bass rumble that seems to come from the earth itself. He's at the window before fully conscious, staring east toward Germany where the horizon flickers like summer lightning. Artillery, lots of it. The sound grows, a sustained roar that makes the cafe's windows rattle in their frames. Other men stumble from sleep, pulling on boots, reaching for weapons with the automatic movements of training overriding confusion. No one speaks the obvious question because speaking it makes it real. If that's an artillery barrage, and it's that big, then everything they've been told about this sector is a lie. The telephone lines to battalion headquarters go dead at 0500 hours, cut by shellfire or sabotage, or the simple chaos of an army being hit where it thought itself safe. Book tries the radio, gets static, tries again. Finally raises a frantic signal operator who says the entire front is being shelled and no one knows anything beyond their immediate position. Stand by for orders. The barrage continues for 2 hours, the longest sustained artillery preparation most of these men will ever experience. Shells fall on Lanzerath itself, German gunners walking their fire across the village in textbook fashion, searching for command posts and assembly areas. The Americans huddle in their positions, feeling the concussions through stone walls, breathing plaster dust, discovering what it means to be on the receiving end of industrial violence. When the barrage finally lifts at 0530, the silence feels unnatural, expectant, like the pause before a wave breaks. Private First Class. James Fort, positioned in an outbuilding with a view down the main road, sees them first, shapes in the mist, moving with the mechanical rhythm of infantry on the march. He counts 50, then stops counting. The fog lies thick in the valley, reducing visibility to 100 yards. But what he can see makes his hands shake on his M1 Garand. German paratroopers, hundreds of them, emerging from the tree line in assault formation. These aren't the exhausted Volkssturm militia the intelligence briefings promised, old men and boys pressed into service as Germany scrapes the bottom of its manpower barrel. These are Fallschirmjäger, elite airborne infantry, moving with the confidence of units that have trained together and expect to win. Fort whispers into his radio handset, trying to keep his voice steady. "Lieutenant, there's a whole German army out there." Book moves between positions, confirming what his men are reporting, his mind racing through tactical calculations that all arrive at the same impossible answer. The German force visible from Lanzerath is division strength at minimum, maybe 15,000 men, and they're moving with the kind of coordination that speaks to careful planning and clear objectives. This isn't a local counterattack or a spoiling raid. This is the main effort of something big, maybe the biggest German offensive since Normandy. And it's aimed directly at the seam in American lines, where 4 divisions try to cover terrain that should require 12. The textbook answer is obvious. Withdraw immediately, report what you've seen, preserve the platoon to fight another day. But withdrawal means exposing yourself on open ground to an enemy that now owns the forest and the roads. It means leaving the high ground and the cover that makes 18 men something more than a speed bump. At 0700 hours, the radio crackles with new orders from battalion, hold at all costs, no retreat. The voice on the other end belongs to a major who's staring at a map and seeing Lanzerath as a critical observation post, not understanding that the observation post is about to be overrun by a force that could walk through it like smoke through a screen door. 30 minutes later, a second transmission. Withdraw immediately to Hüningen. Fall back to the secondary defensive line. The contradictory orders reflect the chaos racing through American command posts all along the front. Officers trying to make decisions with incomplete information, not yet grasping the scale of what's hitting them. Book gathers his squad leaders in the cafe's back room, explains the situation in flat, unemotional terms, then does something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He lets them vote. The vote is nearly unanimous. They stay. The reasoning is simple and terrifying. Retreating means crossing open ground under observation, probably under fire, with no guarantee they'll reach friendly lines before being cut off. Staying means using the terrain they've had days to study, the positions they've carefully prepared, the fields of fire that turn the Lanzerath crossroads into a killing ground for anyone trying to use the road. It's a calculation born from tactical logic and something deeper. A 19-year-old's refusal to run without fighting, the stubborn arithmetic that says, if we're going to die anyway, we might as well make it expensive. Book confirms ammunition counts. Each rifleman has roughly 100 rounds. The machine guns have 1,000 or more, and issues the order that will define the next 12 hours. Pick your targets. Make every shot count. Don't fire until I give the command. In the distance, the German columns continue their advance, unaware that the road they need is defended by 18 terrified kids who've decided not to move. November 10th, 1944. Deep in the Eifel forests of Western Germany, columns of Tiger tanks move through darkness under strict radio silence, their engines rumbling like distant thunder, their crews forbidden to light cigarettes or shine flashlights that might give away positions to Allied aerial reconnaissance. These are not ordinary tanks or ordinary crews. The markings on their hulls identify them as 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal bodyguard formation expanded into an armored division. Veterans of every major German offensive since Poland, men who've learned to fight on 3 fronts and expect to win. They're assembling in woods and villages east of the Belgian border, as part of a concentration of force so massive that keeping it secret seems impossible. Yet somehow, improbably, the Allies remain unaware. The German High Command has codenamed the operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive-sounding name designed to deceive Allied intelligence into thinking this is a contingency plan rather than an offensive. The deception is working. Adolf Hitler conceived this offensive in September, during one of his increasingly rare moments of strategic clarity before the amphetamines and delusions fully consumed his decision-making. His logic contains both brilliance and madness in equal measure. The Western Allies are overextended, their supply lines stretched from Normandy beaches to the German border, their armies separated by terrain and national rivalry. Drive a wedge between the American and British forces, reach the port of Antwerp, and you split the Allied coalition in half, force them to negotiate, buy time for the new weapons, the jet fighters, the improved U-boats, maybe even the atomic research, to change the strategic balance. It's a plan that requires perfect execution, complete surprise, and luck on a scale that Germany hasn't enjoyed since 1940. Hitler believes in it with the fervor of a gambler who's lost everything and sees one last hand to play. The assembly of forces takes 6 weeks and represents a feat of operational security that will puzzle Allied intelligence officers for years afterward. 6th Panzer Army alone concentrates over 200,000 men in a sector where the Americans think maybe 20,000 Germans are present. The movements happen at night, under cloud cover that grounds Allied reconnaissance aircraft, using forests and camouflage discipline that would make peacetime armies proud. Units march to assembly areas and then stop all radio transmissions, communicating only by landline and motorcycle courier. Luftwaffe fighters, husbanded carefully for months, will provide air cover during the critical opening hours. The Germans even create false radio traffic in other sectors, entire phantom divisions chattering on frequencies the Allies are known to monitor, pulling attention away from the Ardennes. It's the kind of operational deception that requires centralized control and military professionalism, the last gasp of a Wehrmacht that still remembers how to fight even as the Nazi regime collapses into barbarism around it. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper receives his orders on December 11th in a nondescript farmhouse that serves as divisional headquarters. At 29 years old, Peiper is already a legend in SS circles and a war criminal by any objective measure. His units have murdered prisoners on the Eastern Front, burned villages, executed civilians, all in the name of operational necessity and racial ideology. He's also one of the most capable armor commanders Germany has produced, a man who understands that modern warfare is about speed and violence, that hesitation kills momentum and momentum wins battles. His Kampfgruppe, battle group, consists of 5,000 men and over 100 tanks, including the massive King Tigers, whose 88mm guns can destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire is impossible. His mission is simple in concept, murderously difficult in execution. Break through American lines, drive west along Route D to the Meuse River bridges, and don't stop for anything. Capture fuel as you go, because Germany doesn't have enough to reach the Meuse. Ignore your flanks, because speed is more important than security. Reach the bridges before Allied reinforcements can organize. The entire German offensive depends on spearheads like Peiper's achieving breakthrough on the first day. The route assigned to Kampfgruppe Peiper threads through a village called Lanzerath, then northwest through Buchholz, Honsfeld, and Bühlingen before turning west toward the Meuse. Route D is chosen because it's one of the few roads in the Ardennes capable of supporting heavy armor, paved surface, and gentle grades that won't bog down 60-ton tanks. It also runs directly through American positions that intelligence identifies as thinly held, green troops from the 99th Division who've barely seen combat. Piper studies the maps with the attention of a man who knows that every hour matters, calculating march rates and fuel consumption, identifying where he'll need to capture American fuel dumps to continue the advance. His timetable allows no margin for error. Break through at dawn on December 16th, reach the Meuse by December 18th, cross before Allied air power can destroy the bridges. 2 days to cover 70 miles of enemy-held territory. It's ambitious even by Blitzkrieg standards. Colonel Helmut von Hofmann commands 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, the paratroop formation tasked with opening the road for Piper's armor. His 15,000 men are paratroopers in name only. Germany no longer has the aircraft or fuel for large-scale airborne operations. So these elite infantry units fight as ground troops, trading their jump wings for the misery of forest combat. Von Hofmann is a professional soldier from the old school, a man who joined the Wehrmacht before the Nazis corrupted it. And he views the coming offensive with professional satisfaction and private dread. Satisfaction because he's been given clear objectives and sufficient force to achieve them. Punch through the American line between Losheim and Losheimer Graben, clear the villages and road junctions, hold the shoulders of the breakthrough while armor exploits into the American rear. Dread because he's read the intelligence estimates on American artillery and air power, and he knows that speed is the only defense against capabilities Germany can no longer match. His men must break through before American artillery can organize defensive fires. They must advance before Allied fighter bombers can turn the narrow Ardennes roads into killing grounds. The final element of the plan involves 1,200 paratroopers under Oberst Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heide, one of Germany's most decorated airborne commanders and a man who considers the mission he's been given borderline suicidal. He's ordered to drop his 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment behind American lines near the town of Malmedy, blocking roads and creating chaos to prevent American reinforcements from reaching the breakthrough sectors. The problems are obvious to anyone with airborne experience. The Luftwaffe transport units assigned to the mission are undertrained and under-equipped, flying antiquated Junkers 52s that are vulnerable to ground fire and prone to navigation errors. The weather forecast predicts low clouds and high winds, precisely the conditions that scatter paratroopers across miles of countryside instead of concentrating them on objectives. Von der Heide voices his concerns to higher command and is told to execute the mission anyway because the offensive requires disruption behind American lines and paratroopers are the only tool available. He begins planning for what he privately considers a one-way trip. December 14th and 15th mark the final 48 hours before execution, and the German forces move into their jump-off positions with the practiced efficiency of units that have done this before. Assault troops crawl forward to within shouting distance of American outposts, close enough to hear conversations and smell cigarette smoke, waiting for the artillery barrage that will signal the attack. Tank companies idle in forest clearings, drivers checking fuel levels and ammunition loads, gunners calibrating sights, commanders reviewing maps one final time. Artillery battalions register their guns on pre-planned targets. American command posts, road junctions, supply dumps, telephone exchanges, using single-ranging shots disguised as harassing fire so the Americans won't realize something is coming. The deception holds to the last moment. American listening posts report increased activity, but battalion and regimental commanders attribute it to normal defensive preparations, not the prelude to a major offensive. Weather becomes the final variable, the one element neither side can control or predict with certainty. The German plan requires low clouds and fog to ground Allied aircraft during the critical first days, and remarkably, unbelievably, the weather cooperates. A high-pressure system stalls over the Ardennes, bringing fog, low overcast, and temperatures that hover just above freezing. Perfect conditions for infantry movement, terrible conditions for air operations. Allied meteorologists forecast improvement within 3 to 4 days, which means the German timetable becomes even more critical. Break through fast, exploit deep, Reach objectives before the weather clears and Allied air superiority reasserts itself. Every German commander from Hitler down to company level understands that they're racing against a meteorological clock as much as American reinforcements. At 0300 hours on December 16th, officers along the assault line check their watches and prepare to signal the artillery. Behind them in the forests, 1,600 guns loaded with high explosive and white phosphorus wait for the order to fire. Tank engines rumble to life, the sound carried away by wind and fog, so American listening posts hear only fragments of noise that could mean anything. Assault troops fix bayonets and check grenade pouches, going through the small rituals that soldiers have performed before battle since warfare began. In a farmhouse command post, Joachim Peiper drinks coffee and stares at a map where a red line traces his route through Lanzerath and beyond, unaware that a 20-year-old American lieutenant is, at that exact moment, settling into positions that will hold that crossroads for the next 12 hours and change everything. 0530 hours, December 16th, 1944. The world ends in fire and noise. Lyle Book wakes to a sound that doesn't belong in any human experience outside of industrial catastrophe or divine wrath. The massed fires of 1,600 German artillery pieces opening simultaneously along 80 miles of front. The cafe walls shudder. Plaster dust falls from the ceiling like toxic snow. The window glass doesn't shatter so much as disintegrate, transforming from solid panes to glittering fragments in the space between heartbeats. He's moving before conscious thought, rolling from his bedding, reaching for boots and helmet and weapon, his body executing the drill sergeant choreography of alarm, while his mind struggles to process what his ears are telling him. This isn't harassing fire. This isn't interdiction on suspected assembly areas. This is a preparation barrage. The kind of artillery symphony that announces major offensives, and it's happening in the sector that every intelligence briefing described as quiet. The barrage follows the German artillery doctrine perfected in 2 world wars: systematic, methodical, designed to destroy communications and demoralize defenders before infantry ever crosses the line of departure. High explosive shells walk through Lanzerath village in a deliberate pattern, searching for command posts and troop concentrations. Phosphorus rounds ignite buildings, creating pillars of chemical flame that burn hot enough to melt steel. The American telephone lines, already fragile, die in the first 15 minutes, cut by shrapnel or blast effect, or the simple bad luck of being strung along roads that German forward observers mapped weeks ago. Book's radio becomes the platoon's only link to higher headquarters, and even that connection crackles with static and competing transmissions as every American unit in the Ardennes tries to report what's happening simultaneously. The radio operator, a kid from Wisconsin whose hands shake so badly he can barely hold the handset, finally makes contact with battalion and delivers a message that will be repeated in dozens of locations that morning. We're being hit hard. Heavy artillery. Need instructions. The instructions, when they come, reflect the chaos racing through American command channels faster than the German shells. Stand fast, observe and report. No wait. Withdraw to secondary positions. No wait. Hold in place until situation clarifies. The contradictions pile up because battalion doesn't know what's happening any better than Book does, and regiment doesn't know any better than battalion, ascending levels of ignorance that reach all the way to division and corps headquarters, where generals are still processing the impossible idea that the Germans have launched a major offensive through terrain everyone agreed was unsuitable for major offensives. Book makes the decision that junior officers have made since warfare began. When higher command gives contradictory orders, follow the one that makes tactical sense and hope the paperwork sorts itself out later. He orders his men to stay in position, use the barrage as cover to improve their fighting positions, and prepare for what comes after the artillery lifts. 600 hours. The barrage continues with mechanical precision, German gunners working their way through fire missions that were planned weeks in advance, registered on maps now being executed with the industrial efficiency that the Wehrmacht still possesses even as the Nazi regime collapses. The 99th Division, spread thin across its overextended front, begins to fragment under the bombardment. Communication nodes disappear in direct hits. Company command posts burn, battalion headquarters evacuate to alternate positions, and lose contact with their forward units in the process. The American artillery, which in theory should be counter-battering the German guns, can't organize effective fires because forward observers are dead or cut off, and the phone lines that would coordinate divisional artillery are shredded. Individual American artillery batteries fire on their own initiative, dropping shells on pre-registered defensive targets, but it's uncoordinated and largely ineffective against an enemy who's already moving through the beaten zones. In Lanzerath, Boke's platoon discovers what it means to be on the receiving end of modern artillery. Private Milosevic, crouched behind his .50 caliber machine gun in a second-floor room, watches the village dissolve into flame and flying debris. A shell hits the church, and the steeple collapses into the nave with a crash that sounds like the end of civilization. Another shell lands in the town square, creating a crater deep enough to hide a jeep. The cafe itself takes near misses that blow in the windows and crack the stone walls, but don't quite collapse the structure. German gunners are focusing their fires on suspected American positions, and apparently the cafe doesn't qualify. The men huddle in their positions, trying to make themselves small, discovering that training never quite prepares you for the psychological assault of sustained bombardment. The noise alone is enough to break concentration, a continuous roar punctuated by the crack boom of nearby impacts, the whistle shriek of incoming rounds, the secondary explosions when something flammable catches fire. 700 hours. The barrage lifts with the same mechanical precision it began, German artillery shifting to targets deeper in the American rear, road junctions, supply dumps, suspected reserve positions, leaving the frontline positions battered but largely intact. The silence that follows feels unnatural, oppressive, like the pressure change before a thunderstorm. Balke moves between his positions, checking on his men, confirming that everyone survived the barrage with only minor wounds and massive doses of adrenaline. Sergeant Slape reports ammunition status unchanged. They haven't fired a shot, so every man still has his basic load. The machine guns are positioned with interlocking fields of fire covering the main road and the open ground to the east. The fields of fire were good before the barrage. They're better now, with several buildings collapsed and sight lines opened. If the Germans come down that road, they'll be walking into a killing ground. The question Buch doesn't voice, because voicing it might make his men refuse to answer it, is whether 18 rifles and 2 machine guns can stop what's coming. The fog thickens as morning advances, a low-lying mist that reduces visibility to less than 100 yards and transforms the landscape into something from a Gothic nightmare. Private Fort, still in his outpost position with a view down the main eastern approach, sees them first. Movement in the mist, too organized to be civilians, too numerous to be a patrol. He focuses his binoculars, and what he sees makes his stomach clench. German infantry in assault formation, multiple companies at least, moving with the confidence of units that own the battlefield. These aren't the ragged Volkssturm that Allied intelligence promised. Old men and boys conscripted in desperation as Germany scrapes the bottom of its manpower. These are Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, identifiable by their distinctive helmets and the quality of their equipment. They're advancing in textbook fashion, scouts forward, main body behind, weapons at the ready, expecting resistance but not expecting it to come from a handful of kids in a cafe. Fort whispers into his radio handset, trying to keep the fear out of his voice and not entirely succeeding. "Lieutenant, there's a whole German army out there. I count at least 200, maybe more. They're heading straight for the village." Buch acknowledges the report and moves to a position where he can see for himself. What he observes confirms his worst tactical fears and also illuminates a glimmer of possibility. The Germans are using the road because the terrain channels them. Thick forest on both sides, muddy ground that would slow an advance. The road offering the path of least resistance toward their objectives beyond Lanzerath. They're moving in column because that's how you move lots of men quickly through restricted terrain, but column formations are vulnerable to enfilade fire. Shots that rake the length of the formation, rather than hitting it head-on. Buch's positions form a rough L shape that will let them shoot into the German column from 2 directions simultaneously. If they maintain fire discipline, if they don't panic, if they make their shots count, they might actually hurt this force badly enough to make it pause. The first German column enters the kill zone at approximately 7:30 hours. Buch counts 300 men, a full battalion, or close to it, marching with the mechanical rhythm of trained infantry on a road march. They're not expecting contact. Why would they? Their intelligence briefings probably describe this sector as lightly held, and the massive artillery barrage should have destroyed or scattered any American forces still in the area. Some of the Germans are smoking cigarettes. Others talk to each other, voices carrying in the cold morning air. They're 300 yards away, then 200, then 100, and Boek's finger hovers over the trigger of his carbine as he calculates angles and timing. The textbook says to let them get close, to wait until you can't miss, to make the first volley count, because surprise is a weapon you can only use once. At 75 yards, close enough to see individual faces and read unit insignia on uniforms, Buck keys his radio and whispers the order that will announce America's defense of Lanzerath Ridge. All positions, fire on my command, pick your targets. Wait, now! The American volley crashes out with startling violence. 18 rifles and 2 machine guns firing simultaneously into a column of men who thought they were safe. The effect is catastrophic. Germans fall like wheat before a scythe, the front ranks cut down before they understand what's happening. Officers shouting orders that can't be heard over the gunfire. Men diving for cover that doesn't exist on an open road. Milosevic's 50 caliber machine gun is particularly devastating, 500-grain bullets traveling at 2,900 feet per second. Heavy enough to penetrate multiple bodies and still retain lethal energy. He walks his fire down the German column, watching men jerk and fall, the mechanical part of his brain, noting that the gun is cycling properly while the human part tries not to think about what he's doing. The initial engagement lasts perhaps 90 seconds, and when it ends with German survivors scrambling back into the forest, the road is littered with bodies and wounded men crying for help in a language the Americans don't speak. Boek estimates 20 to 25 Germans down, dead or wounded, from a single engagement against a force that outnumbered him more than 16 to 1. The question now is whether they've merely annoyed the Germans or actually given them something to think about. 800 hours. The smoke clears from the first engagement, and Lyle Boek faces a decision that will define the rest of his life. His platoon has just inflicted serious casualties on a German formation that probably expected to walk through Lanzerath without opposition, and now the tactical situation has transformed from abstract possibilities to immediate, violent reality. The bodies on the road, he counts at least 18 from his position, though there may be more in the ditches and tree line, prove that surprise and superior positioning can multiply the effectiveness of a small force. But they also prove that he's announced his presence to an enemy that will now hunt him with everything available. The correct decision, according to every tactical manual he studied at officer candidate school, is to withdraw immediately, preserve his force, report what he's observed, and let higher headquarters decide how to respond. But the correct decision assumes a battlefield where communication works, and higher command understands the situation, and neither assumption applies on the morning of December the 16th. 1944. The radio crackles with another transmission from battalion, the third contradictory order in as many hours. This one, delivered by a major who sounds like he's reading from a script, tells Boek to hold his current position at all costs. No retreat. Maintain observation. Report all enemy movements. The order makes sense from battalion's perspective. They need eyes on the Lanzerath crossroads to understand what's coming through that sector, but it makes no sense from Boek's perspective because holding this position against a determined assault will get everyone killed. He acknowledges the order and continues to prepare defensive positions because that's what lieutenants do when they receive orders that might be stupid but are at least clear. 20 minutes later, another transmission. Withdraw immediately to Huningen. Fall back to the secondary defensive line. All forward positions are being consolidated. This order also makes sense in its own context. Preserve the force, trade space for time, establish a coherent defensive line instead of scattering in isolated outposts. It contradicts the previous order completely. Boek gathers his squad leaders in the cafe's back room, away from the younger soldiers who don't need to hear their officers arguing about whether to stay or go. Sergeant Slape, who at 23 is the old man of the platoon, states the case for withdrawal in terms that anyone with tactical sense can understand. They're outnumbered at least 100 to 1 based on what they've seen, probably worse based on what they haven't seen. Their ammunition is finite. They have no artillery support because the phone lines are cut, and the artillery battalions are probably displaced or destroyed. Staying means dying, and dying without accomplishing anything, because once this position is overrun, the Germans will advance anyway. Better to fall back, link up with the main defensive line, fight as part of an organized force instead of a doomed outpost. It's the argument of experience and common sense, and everyone in the room knows it's correct. Then Book makes the counter-argument, speaking slowly as he works through the tactical geometry in his own mind. Withdrawing means crossing open ground, at least 800 yards of fields and gentle slopes with minimal cover, under observation from German positions that now know exactly where they are. The fog that concealed the German advance is starting to lift, and visibility is improving by the hour. They'd be crossing that ground in daylight, probably under fire, with no guarantee they'd reach friendly lines before being cut off by German forces that are almost certainly bypassing Lanzerath to the north and south. The survival rate for a fighting withdrawal across open terrain against superior forces is, according to the statistics Book remembers from his training, less than 50%. Staying in position means using terrain they've had days to study, positions they've carefully prepared, fields of fire that turn the crossroads into a killing ground. The Germans will come again, that's certain, but they'll come into pre-sighted fire zones where 18 determined men can do serious damage. The third option, the one nobody voices because it sounds too much like giving up, is to surrender immediately. Walk out with white flags, accept prisoner of war status, survive to see the end of the war. It's actually the most rational choice from a pure survival standpoint. They're surrounded, outnumbered, cut off from support. But it's also unthinkable for reasons that have less to do with military logic than with what these young men believe about themselves and their obligations. They volunteered for the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon because they wanted to be more than ordinary infantry. They've trained harder, learned more, earned the right to consider themselves elite. Walking away from their first real fight without expending every round and exploring every option feels like betraying that identity. It's not a rational calculation. It's something deeper, the alchemy that turns civilians into soldiers and soldiers into warriors. Buck makes the call that will define everything that follows. He tells his squad leaders they're staying, and then, in a moment of democracy unusual in military settings, he tells them to poll their men. Let everyone vote. This isn't a direct action mission where junior soldiers follow orders without question. This is a decision that might get everyone killed, and the men who'll do the dying should have a say. The vote takes 10 minutes, whispered conversations in fighting positions, and when the squad leaders report back, the result is nearly unanimous. 17 men vote to stay and fight. 1 man votes to withdraw, and he's the platoon medic who argues that his medical oath requires him to prioritize survival over tactical advantage. But even he says he'll stay if that's what the majority wants. The democracy of shared danger has spoken. They're holding this ground. The ammunition inventory becomes critical once the decision is made. Each rifleman started the morning with approximately 100 rounds of 30-06 ammunition for his M1 Garand. They've expended maybe 20 rounds per man in the first engagement, which leaves 80 rounds each, enough for sustained firefight, but not enough for the kind of all-day battle that seems to be developing. The 2 machine guns are in better shape. Milosevic's 50 caliber has roughly 1,200 rounds remaining, though the gun's rate of fire means he could burn through that in less than 3 minutes of sustained shooting. The 30 caliber has about 1,000 rounds. They have grenades, maybe 4 per man, but grenades are close-range weapons that won't help against attackers at distance. Bach does the mental arithmetic. If they maintain fire discipline, if they make every shot count, they might be able to repel 3 or 4 more assaults before running dry. After that, the only options are bayonets and surrender. The tactical advantages of their position become more apparent as Book and Slape walk the perimeter, checking fields of fire and considering angles. The cafe and the adjacent houses sit on a slight rise, maybe 20 feet of elevation above the main road, which gives them observation and a downward fire angle that's harder to assault than flat ground. The road itself is the choke point. Germans trying to bypass through the forest will bog down in undergrowth and mud, while Germans using the road will channel themselves into the kill zone. The American positions are separated enough that a single mortar or artillery strike won't destroy multiple positions, but close enough that they can provide mutual support. It's not a fortress, but it's defensible, especially against an enemy that doesn't yet know exactly where the firing positions are located. The Germans know someone in Lanzerath is shooting at them. They don't know it's only 18 men, and that uncertainty is a weapon. 900 hours. The second German probe develops with more caution than the first. Book watches through binoculars as German infantry moves through the tree line, officers using hand signals to deploy squads into assault positions. The choreography of tactical movement done by soldiers who understand their trade. This time, there's no bunched column offering a target-rich environment. The Germans are spread out, using cover, advancing by fire and maneuver instead of road march. It's a professional response to professional resistance, and it tells Buck something important. The Germans still think they're facing a company-sized force at minimum, maybe more. 18 men couldn't have delivered the volume of fire they experienced in the first engagement, or so the German tactical logic must reason. The American survival depends on maintaining that deception, making the Germans commit more force than necessary, slowing their advance through caution and escalating commitment. The second firefight begins at 9:15 when German scouts breach the open ground and start taking aimed shots at American positions. Bach orders his men to hold fire, let the scouts come, wait for the main force. It takes extraordinary discipline to let enemy soldiers shoot at you without shooting back, but his men maintain the discipline because they understand the logic. Every round they fire reveals a position, and positions that reveal themselves die first. The German main body follows 5 minutes behind the scouts, approximately 200 men in extended line, assault tactics by the book, and Buch lets them close to 100 yards before giving the order to engage. The effect isn't as devastating as the first volley. The Germans are dispersed and using cover, but it's still terrible. Men fall, others drop flat and return fire. The forest edge erupts in muzzle flashes and the crack of rifles. The firefight develops into a sustained exchange, Americans firing from prepared positions, Germans maneuvering under fire, both sides discovering that combat is louder, more chaotic, and less decisive than the training film suggested. 10:30 hours. Private Risto Milosevic has been firing the 50 caliber machine gun for 3 engagements, and his world has contracted to the iron circle of the gun sight, the mechanical rhythm of loading and firing, and the distant abstract understanding that he's killing human beings. The 50 caliber is an anti-materiel weapon, designed to destroy light vehicles and aircraft, not primarily an anti-personnel gun, but against infantry it performs with horrifying efficiency. Each bullet weighs as much as 3 .30-06 rifle rounds and travels at speeds that generate hydrostatic shock. When a 50 cal round hits a human torso, the temporary wound cavity can be as wide as a dinner plate, and the permanent damage is catastrophic. Milosevic has watched men fall and not get up, watched others fall and try to crawl away trailing blood across snow, and some distant part of his mind is cataloging these images for nightmares that will visit him for decades. But the immediate, urgent part of his consciousness is focused on maintaining the gun, keeping it clean and cool enough to function, because if this gun stops working, the defensive position probably collapses. The German tactics are evolving with each assault, learning from failure, adapting to the unexpected resistance. The third attack comes at 1100 hours with indirect fire support. Mortars landing in Lanzerath village, not yet accurately ranged on American positions, but close enough to throw up geysers of frozen earth and shrapnel. The mortar fire forces Americans to hunker in their positions instead of shooting freely, suppressing their fire without destroying them, a textbook application of supporting arms. German infantry follows the mortar barrage in squad rushes, small groups sprinting from cover to cover, while others provide suppressive fire, the kind of tactics that work against prepared defenses if you're willing to accept casualties and maintain pressure. Buch realizes he's watching a company-level assault executed with battalion-level resources, which means the Germans are committing forces far beyond what they'd normally assign to clearing a village. They're taking Lanzerath seriously. The engagement at 1100 hours lasts 40 minutes, longer than any previous firefight, and the ammunition consumption starts to concern Buch. He moves between positions during lulls in the firing, counting rounds, redistributing bullets from positions with more ammunition to positions running low. Private Fort, whose position offers the best view of German assembly areas, reports what looks like battalion-strength forces staging in the tree line, maybe more, and that intelligence changes the tactical calculus completely. This isn't a company clearing a suspected American outpost. This is a major German formation being held up by a platoon-sized element, committing more and more force to break through an obstacle that's become psychologically larger than its actual strength. The Germans have fallen victim to their own respect for American firepower. They think only a company or more could deliver this volume and accuracy of fire, so they're treating the problem as a company-level obstacle, committing the forces necessary to reduce it. Sergeant Slape makes his way to Book's position during a pause in the fighting, and the look on his face tells Book that this conversation isn't going to be pleasant. Slape reports 3 men wounded, none critically but all suffering from shrapnel or grazing rounds that will degrade their combat effectiveness. The .50 caliber has a cracked heat shield from sustained firing and is starting to experience extraction problems, failures to eject spent casings that require manual clearing and slow the rate of fire. Ammunition is down to approximately 50% of starting load, which sounds adequate until you realize they've been in combat for less than 4 hours and the Germans show no signs of stopping. More concerning is the psychological state of the younger soldiers, kids who've gone from peacetime soldiers to combat veterans in a single morning and are starting to show the strain. Nobody's panicking yet, but the edge of panic is visible in the way hands shake while loading magazines, the way eyes dart toward escape routes, the way conversations stop mid-sentence when distant sounds might indicate another assault forming. The tactical situation crystallizes into a race between time and ammunition. Every hour Book's platoon holds Lanzerath is an hour the German timetable bleeds away, an hour that Allied forces elsewhere on the front can use to organize defenses and move reserves. But every hour also consumes bullets and erodes the mental endurance of men who have been in almost continuous combat since dawn. Book does the calculation in his head. At current rates of ammunition consumption, they might last until mid-afternoon, maybe 1,500 hours if they're disciplined. After that, they'll be throwing rocks in harsh language. The correct decision, from a cold, tactical perspective, is to withdraw now, while they still have enough ammunition to fight a rearguard action to preserve the force for future operations. But the correct decision ignores the bodies piling up on the approaches to Lanzerath, the evidence that this position is bleeding the German offensive in ways that might matter to the larger battle. 1,200 hours, and the weather begins to change. The fog that concealed the morning's movements is burning off under weak December sun, visibility improving to 300 yards and more, which cuts both ways tactically. The Americans can see German formations assembling, can count forces and identify assault preparations, but the Germans can also see American positions with increasing clarity, can direct fire more accurately, can spot movement and target reinforcement routes. Buck realizes with growing concern that as visibility improves, the Germans will eventually bring forward artillery observers who can direct accurate fire on identified positions. Once that happens, once heavy artillery starts landing on buildings instead of near them, the defensive position becomes untenable. They're in a race not just against ammunition depletion, but against German artillery coordination, and that's a race they cannot win. The fourth assault develops at 12:30, with a coordination and weight that suggests serious German frustration. Mortars hit Lanzerath in a systematic pattern, walking fire across the village from east to west, and under that barrage, German infantry advances in strength that Book estimates at battalion plus, maybe 500 men or more. They're not using the road anymore, having learned that lesson at the cost of dozens of casualties. Instead, they're moving through the forest edges and across open ground, accepting the movement penalty in exchange for dispersion that makes them harder to kill. Machine guns open up from the German rear, suppressive fire meant to keep American heads down. And under that covering fire, the assault troops close the distance in rushes that bring them within grenade range of American positions. This is serious, coordinated, combined arms warfare. And Book's platoon is on the receiving end. Milosevic's .50 caliber gun jams at the worst possible moment, a double feed that requires him to clear the action and manually extract stuck rounds, while German infantry closes to less than 100 yards. He's cursing steadily, mechanically, the way men do when fear and frustration overwhelm vocabulary, forcing the bolt back, extracting mangled brass, feeling exposed and helpless while tracers snap past his position. He gets the gun back in action after 30 seconds that feel like 30 minutes, And when he resumes firing, the Germans are close enough that he can see individual faces, expressions of determination and fear that mirror what he feels. The gun hammers out bursts of 5 or 7 rounds, the disciplined shooting of a gunner who knows he can't afford to burn through his remaining ammunition, but also knows that if the Germans get much closer, they'll be throwing grenades through his window. The Germans reach the edge of the village, close enough that individual soldiers are lobbing stick grenades toward American positions, the distinctive potato masher grenades tumbling end over end through the air before detonating with flat, percussive bangs. One lands near Private Fort's position and explodes close enough to pepper him with shrapnel, minor wounds that bleed and hurt but don't incapacitate. He returns fire with his Garand, the 8-round clip emptying with the distinctive ping that alerts every nearby soldier to reload, and he's already reaching for another clip when a German round cracks past his head, close enough that he feels the pressure wave. The engagement has devolved into close-quarters violence, the kind of fighting where hesitation means dying and thinking too much means freezing, where training and adrenaline take over from conscious decision-making. Buch makes the decision that will save his position for the next several hours. He calls for artillery support on his own position. The radio contact with battalion is intermittent, static, and competing transmissions. But he gets through to a fire direction center and requests defensive fire's danger, close within 200 yards of his own location. The artilleryman on the other end questions the call. Danger close means American shells will land close enough to kill Americans if the targeting is off by even a few dozen yards. But Buch insists, providing coordinates and saying the words that override normal safety protocols. We're about to be overrun. Fire the mission. 4 minutes later, American 105mm shells begin landing on the eastern edge of Lanzerath, high explosive rounds that detonate with earth-shaking violence, throwing up fountains of frozen dirt and shrapnel that scythes through the German assault force. The effect is immediate and decisive. German infantry, caught in the open with nowhere to go, takes catastrophic casualties from the artillery. The assault breaks, survivors streaming back toward the tree line, dragging wounded when possible, leaving dead when not, the cohesion of the attack dissolving under the systematic violence of high explosive artillery. Buch watches through binoculars, feeling satisfaction and horror in equal measure. Satisfaction because his gamble worked, because American artillery arrived when he needed it and hit where he asked. Horror because he's watching men die by the dozen, seeing the effects of modern firepower against unprotected infantry, understanding at a visceral level what warfare has become in the industrial age. The artillery continues for 5 minutes, methodical and thorough, and when it lifts the ground east of Lanzerath, looks like photographs he's seen from the First World War, cratered, smoking, littered with the wreckage of human bodies. 1,300 hours. The pause after the repelled assault gives Buch's men their first real chance to assess damage, redistribute ammunition, and confront the reality of what they've done. Private First Class. James Fort discovers blood on his uniform and spends 5 minutes trying to determine if it's his or someone else's before concluding it's mostly someone else's. Shrapnel wounds in his shoulder and forearm that hurt but haven't incapacitated him. The platoon medic, working with supplies meant for minor injuries rather than sustained combat, does what he can with pressure bandages and sulfa powder. But he's running low on everything and there's no prospect of resupply. 4 men are wounded enough to reduce their combat effectiveness, though none are so badly hurt they can't still shoot. The more serious casualties are psychological, soldiers staring at nothing, hands trembling, the 1,000-yard stare that signals men approaching their breaking point. The ammunition inventory tells a story of approaching crisis. Most riflemen are down to their last 40 to 50 rounds, less than half their starting load. The 30 caliber machine gun has maybe 400 rounds remaining. Milosevic's 50 caliber is in the best shape proportionally, but also experiencing mechanical problems from sustained firing, the heat shield is cracked, the barrel is wearing visibly, and he's starting to get frequent malfunctions that require manual clearing. They have perhaps 20 grenades total, distributed among 18 positions. Buch does the math and arrives at an ugly conclusion. At current consumption rates, they might have enough ammunition for 2 more major engagements, maybe 3 if they're extraordinarily disciplined. After that, their primary weapons become clubs and bayonets. And he's not optimistic about winning a hand-to-hand fight against battalion-strength German forces. The German response to the artillery defeat reveals both tactical sophistication and growing frustration. Instead of launching another immediate assault, they bring forward their own mortars and begin systematic counter-battery fire, trying to locate and suppress American positions through methodical observation and adjustment. Mortar rounds walk through Lanzerath village in a grid pattern, the German observers somewhere in the tree line making notes about which buildings return fire and which don't, building a targeting picture for later use. It's professional, patient work, the kind of tactical problem-solving that indicates these aren't desperate conscripts throwing themselves at obstacles, but trained soldiers adapting to unexpected resistance. Bach realizes he's fighting an enemy that learns from mistakes and adjusts tactics accordingly, which makes his long-term survival prospects even bleaker. 1,400 hours brings the fifth assault, and this one arrives with a weight and coordination that makes previous attacks seem like probes. German infantry advances in strength. Buch estimates at 600 to 800 men. Multiple companies coordinated in a battalion-level attack, supported by sustained mortar fire that lands on identified American positions with increasing accuracy. They're not using the road or the obvious approach routes anymore. Instead, they're advancing through dead ground, using folds in terrain and forest cover to close the distance before exposing themselves to American fire. It's combined arms tactics executed competently, the kind of assault that should overwhelm a platoon-sized position through weight of numbers and superior fire support. The only reason it doesn't work immediately is that Buch's men have had hours to study the terrain, to identify the approach routes and range them, to prepare for exactly this kind of attack. The firefight that develops is the most intense of the day. Sustained shooting that consumes ammunition at rates that make Buch's earlier calculations obsolete. The Germans get close enough that American soldiers are throwing their precious grenades, the explosions adding to the chaos of rifle fire and machine gun bursts and mortar detonations. Milosevic's 50 caliber gun transforms the approach to his sector into a killing ground, the heavy bullets chewing through cover that would stop rifle rounds, but the gun is overheating badly, and he's forced to pause firing every few minutes to let the barrel cool. Those pauses allow Germans to advance, and twice enemy soldiers get close enough to the cafe that Americans inside can hear them shouting to each other, coordinating movements, close enough that the battle becomes personal rather than abstract. Private Fort finds himself in a position he never imagined during training, trading shots with a German soldier less than 50 yards away, both men using trees for cover, both trying to get an angle on the other without exposing themselves to lethal fire. It's a duel in miniature, repeated across the battlefield as small-scale engagements within the larger battle, and Fort discovers something about himself that he'll spend the rest of his life trying to forget. He's good at this. He's fast, accurate, and calm under pressure, qualities that, in peacetime, would make him an excellent competitive shooter, but in combat make him an efficient killer. He drops 2 German soldiers in quick succession, clean center mass shots that put them down instantly, and feels neither pride nor shame. Only the mechanical satisfaction of seeing targets fall when he pulls the trigger. The assault breaks at 14:45, German forces withdrawing under covering fire from their supporting weapons, leaving more casualties on the frozen ground. Buch tries to count German dead and wounded in his sector and loses count somewhere past 30, and he knows there are casualties in sectors he can't observe. The arithmetic is beginning to work in the Americans' favor in a perverse way. They're outnumbered, but the Germans are paying a price per yard that makes advancing through Lanzerath expensive to the point of being operationally unsound. The German commanders face a classic military dilemma: commit more forces to reduce an obstacle that's already consumed too many resources, or find a way to bypass the obstacle and accept that it remains active in your rear area. Either choice has consequences, and the time spent making that choice is time the American forces aren't advancing toward their objectives. 1,500 hours. The radio crackles with a transmission from battalion, the first communication in over an hour, and the voice on the other end sounds exhausted and confused in equal measure. The situation across the entire American front is chaotic. Some units have been overrun, others are holding, communications are fragmentary, and higher command is still trying to understand the scope of the German offensive. Battalion asks Buch for a situation report, and he delivers it in flat, factual terms. 18 men, 4 wounded, ammunition critical, enemy strength at least battalion plus, holding current position but cannot hold indefinitely without resupply or reinforcement. The response is what he expected but still doesn't want to hear. No reinforcements available, no resupply possible. Hold as long as possible, then fall back on own initiative. It's the kind of order that sounds like command guidance, but actually means you're on your own. Good luck, hope you survive. Sergeant Slape joins Book for a private conversation in the cafe's back room, away from the men who don't need to hear their leaders discussing how bad things have become. Slape is direct in the way senior NCOs can be with young officers they respect. They're out of time and almost out of ammunition. The Germans are going to come again with even more force, and staying in position is no longer delaying the enemy. It's just adding American names to the casualty list. Book knows Slape is right, knows that the tactically sound decision is to withdraw now while they still have ammunition for a fighting retreat, to preserve what's left of the platoon for future operations. But he also knows that every additional hour they hold Lanzerath is an hour the German timetable bleeds away, is an hour that might matter to the larger battle in ways he can't see or understand from his limited perspective. The decision is made for him at 15:30 when German artillery begins landing on Lanzerath with a weight and accuracy that indicates forward observers have finally ranged in on American positions. These aren't mortars anymore. These are full-sized artillery pieces, probably 105 millimeter or larger, and they're hitting buildings instead of near them. The cafe takes a near-direct hit that collapses part of the roof and fills the interior with choking dust. The house where Milosevic operates his .50 caliber takes multiple hits that make the structure unstable, and he's forced to abandon the position and move the gun to alternate location while under fire. The systematic destruction of American positions has begun, and once German artillery finds its rhythm, staying in place becomes suicide rather than defense. Bach gives the order he's been dreading since morning: prepare to withdraw. Not a full retreat. They don't have enough ammunition or mobility for fighting withdrawal, but a staged disengagement, abandoning the positions they've held all day, falling back toward friendly lines, if friendly lines still exist, trying to preserve what's left of the platoon. The men receive the order with relief and regret in equal measure. Relief because they might survive this day after all. Regret because after holding this ground for 8 hours against impossible odds, leaving feels like failure, even though they've done everything asked and more. They begin preparing for withdrawal, gathering essential equipment, helping wounded soldiers, when the German assault that will end the Battle of Lanzerath begins to develop with a weight that makes previous attacks seem like reconnaissance probes. December the 16th, 0800 hours, 6 miles east of Lanzerath. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper stands beside his command vehicle, smoking a cigarette with the mechanical movements of a man trying to control rage through ritual. His Kampfgruppe, 5,000 men, over 100 tanks and armored vehicles, the spearhead of the entire 6th Panzer Army, has been sitting in assembly areas for 3 hours while paratroopers attempt to clear a village that should have fallen in 30 minutes. The radio reports filtering back to him are fragmentary and contradictory. Heavy resistance at Lanzerath, casualties mounting, progress slow. Piper's operational timeline, already tight to the point of being unrealistic, is bleeding away minute by minute while his armor idles in forests and villages, burning irreplaceable fuel to keep engines warm, accomplishing nothing. Every hour of delay is an hour the Americans can use to organize defenses, move reserves, prepare the kind of obstacles that transform blitzkrieg into attrition. The operational plan that brought Peiper to this moment was conceived in optimism and desperation in equal measure. Route D, his assigned axis of advance, was chosen because intelligence identified it as the path of least resistance through the Ardennes. Paved roads capable of supporting heavy armor, terrain that didn't require extensive engineering support. American defenses assessed as thin and poorly coordinated. The plan called for a rolling artillery barrage to suppress American positions, paratroopers to clear infantry obstacles, and then Peiper's armor exploiting into the American rear before anyone could organize coherent resistance. By this time, on December 16th, Peiper should be approaching Honsfeld, 15 miles deep into American-held territory, capturing fuel dumps and leaving chaos in his wake. Instead, he's still east of Lanzerath, listening to reports of a firefight that makes no sense according to the intelligence briefings. Piper's frustration is both personal and professional. Personally, he's a man who's built his reputation on speed and aggression, who believes that modern warfare rewards the commander willing to take risks and push through obstacles rather than reducing them methodically. He's studied the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940 and 41, has internalized the lessons about maintaining momentum, and he knows that losing the first day of an offensive means losing the operational opportunity. Professionally, he understands that the entire German strategic plan depends on spearheads like his achieving breakthrough on schedule. There's no operational reserve, no strategic depth, no margin for error. The Wehrmacht has assembled its last mobile reserves for this offensive, scraped together fuel and ammunition from throughout the Reich, and if this attack fails, there won't be another. The weight of that knowledge presses on every decision. At 1000 hours, Paper's patience begins to fray. He contacts the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division command post and speaks directly with Colonel von Hoffmann, the conversation professional but increasingly heated. Paper demands to know why a single village is holding up an entire division, why infantry cannot clear resistance, that intelligence estimated at company strength maximum. Von Hoffmann's response reveals the central problem. The resistance at Lanzerath is stronger and more professionally executed than anything in the intelligence briefings suggested. His paratroopers have taken significant casualties, the Americans hold superior defensive positions, and reducing the obstacle requires either overwhelming force or time to bring up supporting weapons. Piper's response is the reaction of an armor commander who's watched too many infantry operations bogged down in methodical clearing operations. Bypass the village, use secondary roads, get the armor moving, and let follow-on forces deal with isolated American positions. Von Hoffmann explains why bypass isn't feasible in terms that any armor officer should understand, but that Piper doesn't want to hear. The terrain channels movement, the secondary roads aren't capable of supporting King Tiger tanks that weigh 70 tons. And leaving a competent American force active in your rear area with radio communication to higher headquarters is doctrinally unsound. The conversation ends with Piper ordering von Hoffmann to commit whatever force is necessary to clear Lanzerath immediately. Operational timeline be damned, because every additional hour of delay is another hour Allied reinforcements have to organize. Von Hoffmann acknowledges the order with the careful formality of an officer who knows he's being blamed for circumstances beyond his control, and Piper returns to his maps and his cigarettes and his calculations of how badly the timeline has already slipped. 1200 hours. Piper's supply officer delivers a report that transforms tactical frustration into strategic crisis. Fuel consumption is 30% higher than planned because engines have been idling for hours in cold weather, burning gasoline to maintain operational readiness instead of using it to advance. At current consumption rates, Kampfgruppe Piper will run out of fuel somewhere short of the Meuse River, even if they capture every American fuel dump along their route. And capturing those dumps depends on maintaining the speed to overrun them before defenders can destroy the supplies. Piper has trained his officers to think in terms of fuel range rather than kilometers, to understand that in mechanized warfare, mobility and firepower are functions of petroleum products, and that running out of gas transforms a panzer division into expensive, immobile targets. The arithmetic is simple and brutal. Lose more hours at Lanzerath, and the offensive fails regardless of what happens afterward. The King Tiger tanks that form the armored fist of Kampfgruppe Piper represent both the apex of German tank design and the operational limitations that come with engineering perfection. Each King Tiger mounts an 88mm gun, capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Frontal armor so thick that only direct hits from the heaviest Allied guns can penetrate it, and a weight that makes it nearly invulnerable in direct combat. But that weight also means the tanks consume fuel at prodigious rates, struggle with reliability, and require roads strong enough to support their mass without collapsing. The Tiger crews know their vehicles are superior to anything the Allies field in terms of firepower and protection, but they also know that Allied numerical superiority means that for every German tank, there are 5 or 10 Allied tanks, and eventually numbers matter more than quality. 1400 hours brings a radio report that Piper receives with grim satisfaction. The paratroopers are launching another assault on Lanzerath, this time with battalion-strength forces and artillery support, determined to break through regardless of cost. Piper visualizes the battle from the radio descriptions. American positions being pounded by mortars and artillery, German infantry advancing under supporting fire, the kind of grinding attritional combat that consumes men and time in equal measure. It's not the war he wants to fight, not the lightning warfare that his training and temperament favor, but it's the war the Americans at Lanzerath have forced upon him. He marks the time on his map, calculating that even if this assault succeeds, his force will be 6 to 8 hours behind schedule, and in mobile warfare, hours are the currency of operational success. The irony doesn't escape Piper. He commands a force designed for exploitation, for racing through broken defenses and creating chaos in enemy rear areas. But he's being held up by an obstacle that should have been cleared by infantry before his armor ever reached the front line. It's a failure of combined arms coordination, of the careful synchronization between different combat branches that modern warfare requires. The artillery barrage was supposed to destroy American defenses, making the area safe for infantry. The infantry was supposed to clear obstacles and secure the route before armor arrived. Instead, the plan has broken down at the first point of serious resistance, revealing the brittle nature of operations that depend on everything going according to schedule. Piper has commanded tanks since 1940 and has seen this pattern before. Plans that look brilliant on maps collapse when they meet friction, when the enemy gets a vote, when chaos asserts itself over order. 1600 hours. The sun is setting, temperatures dropping, and Piper receives the report he's been waiting for with increasingly desperate impatience. Lanzerath is clear. American resistance has been overcome. The road is open for his advance. But the time is now 1630 hours. More than 12 hours after the offensive began, and the operational timeline that called for reaching the Meuse River bridges by day 2 is already compromised beyond recovery. Piper orders his column forward immediately, accepting the risks of night movement because stopping now means the Americans gain another full day to organize defenses. The tanks begin to roll, engines roaring, treads chewing frozen ground, and Piper rides at the head of the column with a flashlight and a map, navigating through darkness toward objectives that should have been reached by daylight. The battle for Lanzerath is over, but the consequences of that 12-hour delay are just beginning to cascade through the German operational plan like cracks spreading through ice. 1600 hours, December 16th. The light is failing, temperatures dropping toward 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and Lieutenant Lyle Buch watches the largest German assault of the day forming in the tree line with the detached clarity of exhaustion. His platoon has been in almost continuous combat for over 10 hours, repelling assault after assault, bleeding the German advance one rifle shot at a time. They've inflicted casualties that by any tactical measure should have convinced the Germans to bypass this position, but instead, the Germans are committing more force, escalating their investment in taking Lanzerath as though the village itself has become strategically important beyond its actual value. Buch understands what's happening. They've become a matter of German pride, a symbol of resistance that must be crushed to maintain the momentum and moral authority of the offensive. It's a Pyrrhic distinction that will likely get everyone killed. The ammunition situation has passed critical and entered catastrophic. Most riflemen are down to their last 15 to 20 rounds, barely 2 magazines worth of ammunition in weapons that were designed for sustained firefights. The 30 caliber machine gun is completely dry. The weapon useless until someone finds more belted ammunition that doesn't exist. Milosevic's 50 caliber has perhaps 200 rounds remaining, enough for a few minutes of sustained fire, and then it too becomes an expensive paperweight. They've consolidated ammunition from casualties and non-essential personnel, stripped rounds from magazines and bandoliers, squeezed every possible bullet from their collective load, and it's still not enough. Buch does the math one final time. They might have enough ammunition for one more engagement, maybe 2 if they're extraordinarily disciplined, and the Germans oblige by attacking in smaller groups. After that, the defense of Lanzerath ends not with a heroic last stand, but with empty magazines and clicking firing pins. The German assault that begins at 1630 hours arrives with a weight that makes previous attacks seem like gentle probes. Book estimates 800 to 1,000 men, possibly more, advancing in multiple waves with supporting mortar fire that lands on American positions with accuracy that speaks to use hours of observation and fire adjustment. These aren't probing attacks anymore, aren't tactical reconnaissance or attempts to find weaknesses. This is a deliberate assault by force. The German commander committing whatever resources necessary to break through regardless of cost, because the alternative, bypassing Lanzerath and leaving this American position active in the rear, has become unacceptable. The paratroopers advance with the grim determination of men who've been ordered to take an objective and know that failure means relieving commanders and possibly worse consequences in an army where failure increasingly carries political as well as military penalties. The firefight that develops is apocalyptic in its intensity, the volume of fire exchanged exceeding anything the Americans have experienced in their brief combat careers. Book's platoon fires their remaining ammunition with the discipline of men who know these are their last rounds, making every shot count. Aiming for center mass on targets they can actually hit rather than suppressive fire that achieves nothing. But there are too many Germans and too few Americans, and the mathematics of infantry combat assert themselves with brutal finality. German soldiers get close enough to throw grenades into American positions, the stick grenades tumbling through windows and landing in rooms where Americans huddle behind whatever cover exists. The explosions are flat and percussive, different from the crack of artillery, and they announce that the battle has entered its final phase. Private Milosevic fires his last belt of .50 caliber ammunition in a sustained burst that lasts perhaps 40 seconds, the heavy gun hammering out rounds that chew through German formations one final time before the bolt locks back on an empty chamber. He stares at the weapon that's been his primary contribution to the defense, this machine that's killed dozens of enemy soldiers, and realizes with stunning clarity that it's now completely useless. He picks up his M1 carbine, the personal weapon he's barely touched all day, and joins the rifle fire that's becoming increasingly sporadic as other positions run dry. The sound of the battle is changing, more German fire than American now, the balance of firepower shifting decisively as ammunition depletion transforms defenders into targets. Book empties his last magazine at a German soldier less than 30 yards away, sees the man fall, and performs the automatic movement of reaching for another magazine that isn't there. His carbine is empty. His pistol has one magazine remaining, 7 rounds of .45 caliber that won't stop a determined assault. He has one grenade left. The tactical situation has resolved itself into stark simplicity. They can surrender, they can attempt to retreat across open ground while Germans shoot them down, or they can fight with bayonets and rifle butts until they're killed or overwhelmed. He's opening his mouth to give the order to fix bayonets when German soldiers appear in the doorway of the cafe, rifles leveled, shouting commands in German that need no translation. The defense of Lanzerath is over. The surrender happens in stages, confusion and violence mixing with the strange formality of armed men, acknowledging that combat has ended. Book raises his hands, sees his men doing the same, and experiences the surreal transition from soldier to prisoner that happens in the space between heartbeats. German soldiers move through the American positions, searching for weapons, finding men so exhausted they can barely stand, discovering the empty ammunition boxes and spent brass casings that testify to the intensity of the fight. A German officer, Book later learns he's a company commander in 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, approaches with an expression mixing respect and rage, looking at the 18 Americans who've held his regiment up for an entire day, trying to reconcile the small number of defenders with the casualties they've inflicted. He asks a question in German, gets no response, switches to broken English. You, all this? Gesturing at the defensive position and the battlefield beyond. The German casualties lying on the approaches to Lanzerath tell a story that the Americans are too numb to fully appreciate in the moment. Later estimates, compiled from German after-action reports and American intelligence assessments, will suggest that Book's platoon inflicted somewhere between 400 and 500 casualties on German forces during the 12-hour defense. Dead, wounded, and combat ineffective. The grim taxonomy of infantry warfare. Against a force that outnumbered them at least 50 to 1, probably more, they held ground that tactical doctrine said should have fallen in the first assault. Whether through superior positioning, better training, stubborn courage, or the simple luck of fighting men who make their shots count. They delayed a German armored spearhead by 12 hours and forced the commitment of forces far beyond what should have been necessary to take a village. Colonel von Hoffmann arrives as his soldiers are processing the prisoners, and the look on his face reveals something that Buch will remember for the rest of his life: professional respect mixed with something approaching disbelief. Von Hoffmann speaks better English than his subordinates, asks direct questions about unit strength and organization. And when Buch confirms that the defense was conducted by a single platoon, 18 men, not a company or battalion, the German colonel's expression transforms into something between admiration and fury. He turns to his staff officers and delivers a commentary in German that doesn't require translation, probably noting that his regiment has been held up for an entire day by a force smaller than a single squad. The professional humiliation is evident, and for a moment, Buch wonders if that humiliation will translate into summary execution, the kind of battlefield justice that happens when frustrated soldiers decide prisoners are more trouble than they're worth. The threat of execution is real and immediate. Several German soldiers, enraged by the casualties they've taken, advocate for shooting the prisoners in retaliation for the delay and the dead comrades. Buch hears the arguments even though he doesn't speak German, reads the body language of men pointing at the battlefield and then at the captured Americans, making the case that these prisoners have cost too much to deserve the protection of the Geneva Convention. It's von Hoffmann who intervenes, delivering what sounds like a sharp rebuke to his soldiers, establishing that regardless of casualties or frustration, prisoners of war will be treated according to international law. The decision probably saves Buch's platoon from becoming another Malmedy massacre, another war crime statistic in an offensive that will generate enough atrocities to keep war crimes tribunals busy for years after the war ends. The march into captivity begins as night falls completely, temperatures dropping below freezing, the wounded men struggling to keep pace with guards who show little sympathy for American pain. Buch and his men walk east past German columns moving west, endless streams of tanks and trucks and infantry, the weight of 6th Panzer Army finally rolling forward now that Lanzerath is clear. They see Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe for the first time, the massive King Tiger tanks that probably could have crushed their defensive position in minutes if they'd been available to use, and they understand how close they came to facing an enemy they had no capability to stop. The irony is bitter. They held ground against infantry that they could fight, delaying armor that would have made their resistance meaningless through sheer overwhelming firepower. They pass German soldiers who stare at them with expressions ranging from curiosity to hatred, and Buch tries to keep his platoon together, maintain some semblance of unit cohesion even in defeat, because leadership doesn't end just because you've been captured. December the 16th, 2100 hours. The 18 Americans who defended Lanzerath sit in a stone barn somewhere east of the former front line, guarded by German paratroopers who look at them with the complicated respect soldiers reserve for enemies who've fought well. The transition from combatant to captive has a surreal quality, the adrenaline of combat giving way to exhaustion so profound that some men fall asleep sitting upright despite cold that makes breath visible and fear that should preclude rest. Lieutenant Buch takes inventory of his platoon with the careful attention of a leader who still feels responsible for men, even though he can no longer protect them. 4 seriously wounded, the rest suffering from minor wounds, frostbite, exhaustion, and the 1,000 psychological injuries that come from a day of sustained combat. They're alive, which by any reasonable calculation should be impossible, and that fact provides cold comfort as they contemplate an uncertain future in German hands. The Geneva Convention, established after the First World War to create minimal standards for prisoner treatment, exists as a fragile shield between captured soldiers and the savagery that warfare can descend into when rules disappear. The Germans who captured Buch's platoon are professional soldiers, Wehrmacht paratroopers, who maintain at least nominal adherence to international law, even as the Nazi regime around them abandons any pretense of civilized warfare. But the convention's protections depend on captors who choose to honor them, and on this particular night in the Ardennes, with German forces behind schedule and American resistance proving stronger than expected, that choice feels precarious. Buch knows from intelligence briefings that SS units have murdered American prisoners in previous campaigns, that the rules of war erode in proportion to desperation and ideology, and that his platoon survival depends as much on luck as on international treaties. The German guards bring food, black bread and ersatz coffee that tastes like burned wood, and allow the American medic to treat wounded soldiers with supplies scavenged from German medical kits. The gesture represents a minimal adherence to Geneva Convention requirements, but it also reveals something about the soldiers guarding them. These are men who still recognize distinctions between combatants and war criminals, who can separate professional military duty from the ideological barbarism that characterizes the worst of Nazi Germany. Book watches the interaction between guards and prisoners, searching for signs of the hatred that might precede violence, and instead finds mostly indifference mixed with curiosity. The Germans want to know who they were fighting, want to understand how such a small force held up their advance for an entire day, want confirmation that they weren't defeated by company strength forces, but actually fought platoon-sized resistance to the point of culmination. A German lieutenant arrives around midnight with a translator, conducting an initial interrogation that focuses more on tactical details than strategic intelligence. He wants to know about American defensive tactics, about the training that produced such effective resistance, about whether Book's platoon represented typical American combat capability or exceptional performance. Book provides name, rank, and serial number as required by the Geneva Convention, refuses to answer tactical questions, and watches the German officer's reaction carefully. The lieutenant seems more interested in professional understanding than intelligence gathering, asking questions the way a student might ask a teacher, trying to learn from an experience that clearly surprised him. The interrogation ends without coercion or threats, another small indication that these particular Germans are following at least basic rules of prisoner treatment. The conversation turns to casualties, and Book learns for the first time the price his platoon extracted from the German forces. The lieutenant, either through professional candor or deliberate psychological warfare, confirms that 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division took over 400 casualties attempting to clear Lanzerath, dead, wounded, and missing, the numerical cost of forcing a passage through resistance that should have collapsed in the first assault. He states this fact without apparent emotion, but the implication is clear. 18 Americans inflicted casualties on a scale that should require company or battalion strength forces to achieve. Whether the lieutenant intends to compliment American effectiveness or to justify German difficulties in reducing the position isn't clear, but the information provides Book with something he desperately needs: confirmation that their stand mattered, that the 12 hours they bought with blood and ammunition had operational consequences beyond their immediate survival. December the 17th brings the beginning of a journey that will eventually take Book's platoon to Stalag Nanai B and other prisoner-of-war camps deep in Germany, but the immediate concern is surviving the chaos of the first days of the offensive. German forces are streaming west, supply lines are chaotic, and prisoners represent a logistics burden that some commanders view as expendable. The platoon is moved from the barn to a collection point where other American prisoners are being assembled, dozens of men from various units, all captured in the opening days of the offensive. The collection point is a bombed-out village where guards are scarce and discipline is breaking down, where wounded men receive minimal medical attention and food is whatever can be scavenged from destroyed buildings. It's here that Book hears the first rumors of the Malmedy massacre, 84 American prisoners murdered by Kampfgruppe Piper at a crossroads south of their current location, shot down in a field while unarmed and under guard. The Malmedy massacre represents everything that can go wrong when the rules of warfare collapse into barbarity, and its proximity both in time and space to Book's capture makes his platoon's survival feel even more precarious. Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe, the same armor force that was delayed by Lanzerath's resistance, murdered those prisoners on December the 17th. Either on Piper's orders or with his tacit approval, in what would become one of the most notorious war crimes of the Battle of the Bulge. The massacre creates a terrible calculus for American prisoners. Survival depends partly on which German unit captures you, partly on the tactical situation when you're captured, partly on the temperament of individual guards, and partly on luck that has nothing to do with Geneva Convention protections or international law. Book's platoon was captured by Wehrmacht paratroopers, not SS troops, and that distinction may have saved their lives. The journey into Germany proper begins on December 18th, when the prisoners are loaded into freight cars for transport to permanent POW camps. The conditions are medieval, 60 men packed into cars designed for 40, no sanitation facilities, minimal food, winter cold, seeping through wooden slats. Men stand for hours because there's no room to sit. Wounded soldiers cry out when the train lurches and reopens injuries, and the smell of unwashed bodies and untreated wounds becomes overwhelming. Buck maintains what leadership he can, organizing his platoon to support each other, sharing what little food exists, keeping morale from collapsing completely. The train moves east through Germany, occasionally stopping in rail yards where Allied bombing has destroyed infrastructure, sitting for hours or days while German rail officials figure out alternate routes. Through the gaps in the freight car walls, the Americans catch glimpses of a Germany that's visibly collapsing, cities reduced to rubble, civilians scavenging through ruins, the physical evidence of strategic bombing's effects. Stalag 9B, the camp where most of Buck's platoon eventually arrives, represents the German POW system at its most bureaucratically efficient and simultaneously most dehumanizing. The camp houses thousands of prisoners from multiple nations, Americans, British, French, Russians, separated by nationality and guarded by soldiers too old, too young, or too injured for frontline service. The conditions violate Geneva Convention standards systematically: inadequate food, minimal medical care, overcrowded barracks, forced labor in conditions that kill prisoners through exhaustion and malnutrition. But compared to the concentration camps operating elsewhere in Germany, compared to the treatment of Russian prisoners who die by the millions, compared to the fate of civilians in occupied territories, Stalag 9B represents a kind of minimal protection, the difference between harsh captivity and deliberate genocide. The winter of 44 to 45 in German POW camps is a study in slow-motion suffering, the kind of ordeal that doesn't kill quickly, but grinds down health and hope through sustained deprivation. Buck and his men survive on rations that provide perhaps 1,200 calories per day, when hard labor requires 3,000, supplement their diet with whatever can be scavenged or stolen, watch fellow prisoners die from dysentery and pneumonia, and the accumulated effects of malnutrition. The psychological warfare is almost worse than the physical conditions. No reliable news from the front, no communication with families back home, no knowledge of whether the war will end in months or years. Some men maintain hope through faith or stubbornness, or the conviction that the Allies are winning and liberation is inevitable. Others descend into the kind of nihilistic despair that kills as surely as disease. Liberation comes in April 45, when advancing American forces overrun Stalag 9B, finding thousands of emaciated prisoners and evidence of conditions that will contribute to war crimes prosecutions. Buck's platoon has survived. All 18 men who were captured at Lanzerath lived to see liberation, a survival rate that seems miraculous given the casualties among other POW populations. They're repatriated to American lines, processed through medical facilities that document their weight loss and injuries, and eventually shipped back to the United States, where they'll face the complicated work of returning to civilian life after experiences that have fundamentally changed them. The war in Europe ends a month after their liberation. Germany surrenders, and the men who held Lanzerath Ridge for 12 hours return home to a country that's celebrating victory without any knowledge of what that platoon accomplished or sacrificed. December 16th, 2100 hours. Kampfgruppe. Piper finally rolls through Lanzerath 12 hours behind schedule, the massive tanks churning frozen ground, infantry riding on armored hulls, the columns stretching for miles in the darkness. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper rides at the front in his command half-track, navigating by flashlight and map, driving his force westward with the kind of desperate urgency that comes from knowing you're already late to a battle where timing is everything. The delay at Lanzerath has compressed his operational timeline to the point where the original plan, methodical advance, capture objectives in sequence, consolidate before pushing forward, has become impossible. Instead, Piper chooses speed over security, momentum over caution, accepting risks that would make conventional commanders blanch because the alternative is arriving too late to matter. The beast has been unleashed, and what follows will be remembered as one of the most brutal armored drives in Western Front history. The tactical situation Piper faces would challenge any commander. Advance through enemy territory at night, on roads you don't know well, against opposition whose strength and location are uncertain, with fuel supplies barely adequate for your planned route and no margin for detours. His solution is characteristically aggressive. Don't stop. Don't wait for flanks to be secured. Don't reduce every obstacle methodically. Drive forward. Use speed and shock to overwhelm resistance before it can organize. Capture fuel where you find it. And trust that momentum will carry you through situations where stopping would mean death. It's the doctrine of blitzkrieg refined to its essence, the kind of operational art that produces spectacular successes or catastrophic failures with little middle ground. In the early morning hours of December 17th, as Piper's Kampfgruppe smashes through American positions at Buchholz Station, the doctrine seems to work exactly as designed. Buchholz Station falls to Kampfgruppe Piper at 0300 hours on December the 17th in a night attack that catches American defenders completely unprepared. The positions are held by elements of the 99th Division, soldiers who have heard rumors of German offensive but haven't received orders to withdraw or reinforce. Piper's lead tanks emerge from darkness with all guns firing, high explosive rounds and machine gun fire raking American positions, infantry following behind to mop up survivors. The engagement is brief and one-sided, American resistance collapsing under the weight of armor they can't stop, and infantry they outnumber but can't outfight in a meeting engagement. Prisoners are taken, several dozen Americans captured in their sleeping positions or while trying to organize defense. And Piper faces the first of many decisions that will define his Kampfgruppe's reputation. What to do with prisoners when you're racing against time and prisoners slow you down. The Malmedy massacre begins at approximately 1300 hours on December the 17th at a crossroads called Bonniers, south of the town of Malmedy, when Kampfgruppe Piper's advance guard encounters a convoy of American vehicles and forces them to surrender. 84 American prisoners, artillerymen, engineers, medics, a cross-section of support troops caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, are herded into a field and murdered, shot down by machine gun fire while unarmed and under guard, finished off with pistol shots to survivors who show signs of life. The massacre will become one of the defining atrocities of the Battle of the Bulge, will result in war crimes, trials, and executions after the war, will stain the reputation of the 1st SS Panzer Division permanently. Whether Piper directly ordered the killings, or whether they resulted from subordinate initiative and tacit approval, remains historically contested. But the operational context is clear. Prisoners slow an advance that's already behind schedule, and SS ideology has long since abandoned the idea that enemy soldiers deserve protection once they've surrendered. The capture of the American fuel depot at Bühlingen on December 17th represents the kind of tactical windfall that Piper's entire operation depends on. His Kampfgruppe arrives to find approximately 50,000 gallons of American gasoline, enough to refuel his entire force and extend his operational range by days instead of hours. German soldiers fill their tanks, jerry cans, anything that can hold fuel, consuming American supplies that were meant to support Allied advances and instead using them to drive deeper into Allied territory. The irony would be poetic if it weren't so militarily consequential. American logistics efficiency, the same superior supply system that's giving the Allies overwhelming material advantage in the war, is now fueling a German counteroffensive that threatens to split Allied armies and potentially change the strategic balance in Europe. The advance from Bühlingen towards Stavelot follows Route D through territory that American forces are only beginning to understand is under attack. Piper's column moves through villages and past isolated American positions, sometimes stopping to fight when resistance organizes, sometimes bypassing obstacles when speed seems more important than security. Belgian civilians flee their homes or hide in cellars as the German column passes, and in several villages Piper's troops commit the kind of casual atrocities that characterize SS operations. Civilians shot for suspected resistance activities, houses burned to deny cover to potential American forces, summary executions of anyone who seems suspicious or inconvenient. These killings don't receive the historical attention of Malmedy, but they're part of the same pattern of violence that marks Kampfgruppe Piper's route through the Ardennes like a trail of blood. American forces begin to respond to the breakthrough with the kind of improvised crisis management that characterizes military organizations under stress. Engineer units are rushed to river crossings to prepare demolitions. Infantry battalions are pulled from quiet sectors and sent to block German advance routes. Artillery batteries displaced to new positions where they can fire on reported German columns. But the response is fragmented, uncoordinated, reactive instead of proactive, because American commanders are still trying to understand the scope of the offensive and identify the main German thrusts. Piper benefits from this confusion, driving through gaps between American units, exploiting the space before defenders can close it, creating exactly the kind of chaos and dislocation that Blitzkrieg doctrine promises. By the evening of December 17th, his Kampfgruppe has advanced approximately 25 miles from their start line, deep into American-held territory, approaching the Amblève River crossing at Stavelot. Stavelot represents the kind of choke point that armor commanders dread, a river crossing in a town with a bridge that's the only viable route for heavy vehicles, defended by American forces who have had hours to prepare demolitions and organize fire support. American engineers rig the bridge with explosives while infantry takes up positions covering the approach routes. And when Piper's lead elements arrive in the early evening of December 17th, they face the first serious organized resistance since breaking through at Buchholz. The ensuing firefight is brief but consequential. German tanks engage American positions with main gunfire, while infantry attempts to rush the bridge, and in the critical moment when speed could have seized the crossing intact, American engineers blow the charges. The bridge drops into the Amblève River with a roar that marks the end of Piper's momentum and the beginning of his operational crisis. The destruction of Stavelot Bridge transforms Piper's situation from aggressive exploitation to potential encirclement. Without the bridge, his Kampfgruppe can't continue west toward its objectives. The Amblève River behind him and the American forces beginning to organize on his flanks mean he's now in a salient, deep in enemy territory, without secure supply lines or reliable routes for retreat. Piper attempts to find alternate crossings, sends reconnaissance elements to explore other bridges and fords, but American forces are beginning to converge on his position with the kind of numerical superiority that makes every hour of delay more dangerous. The fuel captured at Bullingen, which seemed like a windfall hours ago, is burning away as tanks maneuver, searching for crossings that don't exist, or have already been demolished by American engineers working ahead of the German advance. December 18th through 22nd becomes a period of increasing desperation for Kampfgruppe Piper, trapped in and around the village of La Glaise, surrounded by growing American forces, consuming supplies with no prospect of resupply. The weather begins to clear on December 20th, and with clear weather comes American air superiority. Fighter bombers that attack German columns with devastating effectiveness, artillery spotting from aerial observation, interdiction of any German attempt to reinforce or resupply Piper's position. The Kampfgruppe that broke through with over 100 armored vehicles is reduced to fighting from static positions, using their superior armor and firepower to hold off American attacks while hoping for relief that grows less likely each day. By December 23rd, with fuel exhausted and ammunition critically low, Piper makes the decision to abandon his vehicles and escape on foot through American lines, leaving behind the tanks and equipment that represented Germany's last mobile reserve in the West. The ultimate fate of Kampfgruppe Piper, vehicles abandoned, approximately 300 men killed or captured, the entire formation effectively destroyed as a combat force, represents the culmination of delays and decisions that began at Lanzerath Ridge. The 12 hours lost. Clearing that village meant arriving at Stavelot after American engineers had time to prepare demolitions. The time spent at Stavelot meant American reinforcements could organize blocking positions. Each delay cascaded into larger operational consequences until the entire offensive timeline collapsed, transforming what was supposed to be a lightning drive to the Meuse River into a desperate fighting retreat that consumed Germany's last armored reserves without achieving any strategic objectives. Piper himself will survive the war, stand trial for war crimes at Malmedy and other locations, serve time in prison, and eventually be murdered by unknown assassins in France in 1976, his past catching up with him decades after the battles ended. December 17th, 1400 hours. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles. General Dwight Eisenhower sits at a conference table covered with maps, listening to staff officers deliver situation reports that transform yesterday's quiet sector into today's operational crisis. The German offensive is bigger than initial reports suggested, hitting harder across a wider front, achieving penetrations that threaten to split American 1st and 3rd armies, maybe reach the Meuse River, possibly even Antwerp if the breakthrough isn't contained. Eisenhower's response reveals the kind of strategic flexibility that characterizes his command style. Instead of trying to hold everywhere, identify the critical points, rush reserves to those positions, trade space for time while organizing counterattacks. The orders flowing from this conference will ultimately defeat the German offensive, but their effectiveness depends on buying time. Time that Buch's platoon and dozens of other small units are purchasing with their blood at places like Lanzerath Ridge. The strategic geography of the Ardennes Offensive reveals why certain positions matter more than others, why some villages become critical terrain while others remain forgotten backwaters. Bastogne, a road junction town in southern Belgium, controls 7 major routes radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Capture Bastogne, and you control movement throughout the southern Ardennes. Bypass it, and you leave American forces positioned to cut German supply lines and counterattack into your flanks. Eisenhower identifies Bastogne as critical within hours of the offensive beginning, commits the 101st Airborne Division to defend it, accepts that this decision might trap an elite unit, but also might prevent German forces from achieving the kind of operational mobility that Blitzkrieg requires. The 101st begins moving toward Bastogne on December the 17th, racing German forces toward a town that neither side initially considered strategically significant. The race to Bastogne becomes a study in cascading consequences, where hours matter more than miles. German forces advancing from the east should reach the town on December 19th if they maintain their initial momentum. Encircle it before American reinforcements arrive, reduce it through siege or assault, and continue west toward the Meuse. But momentum requires maintaining timeline. And timeline has already been compromised by unexpected resistance at places like Lanzerath. The delays add up. 6 hours here, 8 hours there, half a day spent reducing positions that should have fallen in minutes. By the time German forces approach Bastogne on December 19th, the 101st Airborne has arrived, dug in, established defensive positions that transform a race into a siege. The temporal margin is measured in hours. American paratroopers arrive approximately 2 to 4 hours before German encirclement could have closed completely, threading through a gap that's closing in real time. The siege of Bastogne becomes one of the defining engagements of the Battle of the Bulge, the surrounded airborne division holding against repeated German assaults, buying time for Patton's Third Army to drive north and break the encirclement, ultimately forcing German forces to commit resources to reducing an obstacle that they can't bypass but also can't quickly overcome. The strategic effect is exactly what Eisenhower hoped for. German mobile forces become fixed, attacking prepared defenses instead of exploiting into open terrain, consuming fuel and ammunition in siege operations instead of racing toward objectives. The operational tempo that Blitzkrieg requires, maintain speed, bypass obstacles, keep moving before the enemy can organize, breaks down completely when your advance is channeled through towns you can't bypass and can't quickly capture. The weather becomes a strategic factor as significant as ground forces or tactical decisions. The German offensive plan depended on low clouds and poor visibility to ground Allied air superiority during the critical opening days, and, remarkably, the weather cooperated, fog and overcast. From December 16th through 19th gave German forces freedom of movement without fear of air attack. But weather forecasts predicted clearing conditions by December 20th, and clearing weather means American and British aircraft can return to the skies with the kind of numerical superiority that makes daylight movement suicidal for German forces. On December 23rd, the weather clears, and within hours Allied fighter bombers are ranging across the Ardennes, attacking German columns, destroying supply trucks, interdicting reinforcement routes, providing the kind of aerial devastation that transforms roads into graveyards. The impact of Allied air power once weather permits operations reveals the fundamental strategic imbalance between Allied and German forces by late 1944. The Allies can replace losses, can surge aircraft from bases in France and England, can maintain sustained operations because their logistics allow it. Germany is fighting on fumes, limited fuel for aircraft, limited replacement capacity for losses, pilots who are often undertrained because flight schools can't afford to spend fuel on extended instruction. When the weather clears and Allied aircraft fill the skies, German forces discover that movement in daylight brings immediate and catastrophic consequences. Convoys are shot up, tanks are destroyed by rocket-armed fighters. Any concentration of vehicles draws airstrikes that kill crews and destroy equipment faster than ground combat could achieve. General George Patton's Third Army launches its relief attack toward Bastogne on December 22nd, a 90-degree pivot from attacking eastward into Germany to attacking northward into the German salient, executed with the kind of aggressive confidence that characterizes Patton's command style. The movement involves disengaging from current operations, rotating entire divisions through 90 degrees, coordinating with new headquarters, and attacking into the flank of a German offensive, the kind of complex maneuver that military theorists consider extraordinarily difficult and that Patton accomplishes in less than 72 hours. The attack breaks through German containment forces and reaches Bastogne on December 26th, ending the siege and beginning the systematic reduction of the German salient. Patton's ability to execute this maneuver depends partly on his own aggressive leadership, but also on the time purchased by defenders like Buch's platoon, time that prevented German forces from achieving breakthrough before American reserves could organize. The strategic arithmetic of the Battle of the Bulge reveals itself through the lens of time and distance. German forces penetrated approximately 60 miles into Allied-held territory at the offensive's deepest point, nowhere near the 100-plus miles required to reach the Meuse River and the 150 miles to Antwerp. They consumed Germany's last strategic reserves, approximately 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, irreplaceable fuel and ammunition, without achieving operational objectives that would have justified those losses. The offensive failed not because of a single decisive battle, but because of accumulated delays, small unit resistance that disrupted timetables, logistical constraints that German planning failed to adequately address, and Allied responses that traded space for time while organizing overwhelming counterattacks. The 12 hours lost at Lanzerath didn't defeat the German offensive alone, but those hours were part of the accumulated friction that ground German momentum to a halt before strategic objectives could be achieved. The counterfactual question haunts historians and participants alike. What happens if Kampfgruppe Peiper clears Lanzerath at 0900 hours instead of 2100 hours, reaches Stavelot before American engineers can demolish the bridge, crosses the Amblève River with momentum intact, and drives westward toward the Meuse before Allied reinforcements can organize? The answer requires speculation about variables that can't be known with certainty. But the operational logic suggests that even marginal improvements in German timeline could have produced significantly different outcomes. Paper at the Meuse on December 18th instead of trapped at L'Église would have forced Allied responses that didn't exist in historical reality, possibly emergency withdrawals from other sectors, definitely crisis-level strategic decisions about whether to hold territory or preserve forces. The historical reality is that those decisions never had to be made because Paper never reached the Meuse, and part of the reason he never reached the Meuse traces back to a crossroads village where 18 Americans decided to stand and fight. January 25, 1945. The Battle of the Bulge officially ends when American forces eliminate the last German salient and restore the pre-offensive lines, though fighting continues in scattered sectors for days afterward. The statistical accounting of the battle reveals costs on a scale that dwarfs individual actions, but doesn't diminish their significance. 19,000 Americans killed, 47,000 wounded, 23,000 captured or missing. Approximately 90,000 total casualties from a battle that lasted 6 weeks. German casualties are harder to calculate precisely, but probably exceed 100,000 killed, wounded, and captured, plus the material losses that Germany cannot replace. Roughly 800 tanks destroyed, hundreds of aircraft lost, fuel and ammunition consumed in quantities that a collapsing war economy cannot replenish. Both sides paid in blood for terrain that ultimately didn't change hands, for operational objectives neither achieved, for strategic goals that remained as distant on January 25th as they were on December 15th. The immediate Allied response treats the Battle of the Bulge as a temporary setback, an interruption in the steady advance toward Germany that cost time and casualties but didn't fundamentally alter the war's trajectory. This interpretation has merit. The Western Allies were never in danger of losing the war because of the Ardennes Offensive, were never so critically threatened that strategic defeat seemed likely. But the interpretation also misses the narrower margin of outcomes that existed in December 1944. The possibility that a more successful German offensive could have achieved limited objectives with outsized consequences. German forces reaching the Meuse wouldn't have won the war, but they would have split Allied armies, captured critical supply depots, possibly forced a temporary operational pause while the Allies reorganized. Those consequences might have extended the war by months, might have allowed Germany to deploy new weapons systems like jet aircraft in greater numbers, might have complicated the endgame diplomacy between Western allies and the Soviet Union. The political dimensions of the offensive reveal Hitler's strategic calculus, flawed but not completely irrational. By late 1944, Germany faced the inevitability of defeat unless something fundamental changed. Either the Allied coalition fractured, or new weapons technology provided a decisive advantage, or successful military operations convinced Allied leaders that negotiated settlement was preferable to unconditional surrender. The Ardennes Offensive represented a gamble on all three possibilities: split the Allied armies and maybe crack the coalition, buy time for wonder weapons to reach operational deployment, inflict casualties severe enough to make Western leaders reconsider their strategic objectives. The gamble failed completely. The Allied coalition held, no wonder weapons arrived in time to matter, and the casualties strengthened Allied resolve rather than undermining it. But the logic that produced the gamble reflects Germany's limited strategic options in the war's final year. Post-war interrogations of German commanders reveal a consistent theme. The unexpected resistance encountered in the offensive's opening hours disrupted operational timeline and prevented the achievement of first-day objectives that subsequent success depended upon. Colonel von Hoffmann, commanding 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, describes in after-action interviews the fanatic defense at Lanzerath that held up his regiment and delayed Kampfgruppe Piper's advance beyond recovery. SS Brigadeführer Fritz Kramer, Chief of Staff to 6th Panzer Army, attributes the offensive's failure partly to unexpected resistance at small villages and road junctions that our intelligence had assessed as lightly held. These testimonies don't name Buch or his platoon specifically. German commanders probably never knew the identity of the force that held them up. But they confirm that small unit resistance had operational consequences beyond immediate tactical effects. Joachim Piper survives the war and faces trial at Dachau in 1946 for war crimes committed during the Ardennes Offensive. Specifically, the Malmedy massacre and the murder of Belgian continue 4:21 p.m. civilians along his route of advance. The trial proceedings reveal the operational context of the atrocities. A Kampfgruppe behind schedule, frustrated by resistance, operating under SS ideology that viewed Geneva Convention protections as weakness and murder as operational efficiency. Paper testifies that he never directly ordered prisoner executions, but also doesn't deny that his subordinates committed war crimes with his tacit approval, or at minimum, without his effective control. He's sentenced to death by hanging, later commuted to imprisonment, and eventually released after serving 11 years. He settles in France under an assumed name and is assassinated in 1976 by unknown attackers who may have been French resistance veterans, Nazi hunters, or simply people who believed that his crimes demanded a reckoning that prison time didn't satisfy. The strategic assessment of the Battle of the Bulge evolves over decades as historians access archives and interview participants, moving from initial interpretations that viewed the offensive as a desperate gamble, doomed to fail, toward more nuanced analysis that recognizes how close Germany came to achieving limited objectives. The consensus that emerges acknowledges both the fundamental strategic weaknesses that made German defeat inevitable and the tactical execution problems that prevented them from achieving what limited success their strategic situation might have allowed. The offensive consumed Germany's last mobile reserves without achieving breakthrough, accelerated the Western Front's collapse by forcing Germany to commit forces that could have defended the Rhine, and demonstrated that even in desperate circumstances, German operational planning remained fatally flawed by unrealistic logistics and insufficient appreciation for Allied capabilities. The fuel crisis that doomed Kampfgruppe Peiper reveals systemic problems with German operational planning throughout the offensive. The plan required German forces to capture Allied fuel dumps and use them to continue the advance, a dependency on enemy logistics that military planners normally consider unacceptably risky. German forces did capture some American fuel, Peiper's seizure at Bullingen being the most significant, but not enough to support sustained operations. And the assumption that you can live off enemy supplies while conducting mobile operations in enemy-held territory proved fatally optimistic. The broader fuel situation in Germany by late 1944 was catastrophic. Synthetic fuel plants damaged by Allied bombing, Romanian oil fields lost to Soviet advances, transportation networks so disrupted that available fuel couldn't reach frontline units. The Ardennes Offensive consumed fuel reserves that Germany couldn't replace, meaning that even if operational objectives had been achieved, sustaining those gains would have been problematic. The impact of weather on the battle's outcome remains one of the more debated aspects of historical analysis. German planning correctly predicted that early winter weather would ground Allied aircraft, and the fog and overcast of December 16th through 19th did provide German forces freedom of maneuver without fear of air attack. But German planners apparently failed to adequately consider what happens when weather clears, when Allied air superiority returns with concentrated fury, when every road becomes a kill zone, and every vehicle concentration draws fighter-bomber attacks. The clear weather that arrived December 23rd transformed the operational environment decisively in Allied favor, allowing air power to compensate for ground losses and to interdict German forces attempting to reinforce or withdraw from the salient. Whether better German weather forecasting would have altered operational decisions is unclear, but the weather effect demonstrates how dependent German success was on factors beyond their control. The Allied response to the offensive reveals both the flexibility of American military organization and the benefits of material superiority. Within 72 hours of the offensive beginning, Eisenhower had committed strategic reserves to critical points, reorganized command relationships to improve coordination, and authorized aggressive counterattacks instead of passive defense. This response was possible because the United States industrial base could replace losses, because logistics systems could redirect supplies to threatened sectors, because the depth of Allied resources allowed committing reserves without fatally weakening other sectors. Germany, by contrast, was fighting with no strategic reserve beyond what was committed to the offensive, no replacement capacity for catastrophic losses, no margin for error in an operational plan that required near-perfect execution. The material imbalance that characterized the war by late 1944 meant that Germany needed not just success, but near-perfect success to achieve anything meaningful, while the Allies could absorb setbacks and still retain overwhelming advantage. February 1945, Stalag in Neuerby, Germany. Lieutenant Lyle Bauch huddles in a barracks that provides shelter but not warmth, consuming a diet that prevents starvation but not malnutrition, contemplating a future that's shrinking toward the narrow question of daily survival. The liberation is still months away, the war's end visible to anyone studying the strategic situation, but not yet manifest in ways that improve conditions for prisoners of war. Around him sleep or try to sleep the men who defended Lanzerath Ridge, 18 soldiers who held a crossroads for 12 hours against forces that outnumbered them 50-1, who delayed a German armored spearhead by half a day, who possibly altered the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge through sheer stubborn refusal to withdraw. None of them have received any recognition for their action. None of them will receive recognition for decades. They are, in the bureaucratic language of military administration, simply prisoners awaiting repatriation, distinguishable from thousands of other POWs only by memories of a battle that seems increasingly surreal with the passage of time. The liberation comes in April 1945 when American forces overrun Stalag Neski B, and Bauck's first emotion is relief so profound it feels like physical pain, relief that he survived, relief that the war is ending, relief that he'll see home again. The processing through repatriation centers involves medical examinations that document the effects of 5 months as POW, weight loss averaging 30 to 40 pounds per man, vitamin deficiencies, untreated injuries, the physical signature of sustained malnutrition. The psychological effects don't show up in medical examinations, don't have obvious symptoms beyond nightmares and startle responses and difficulty readjusting to civilian life. But they're there in every man who defended Lanzerath and lived through the aftermath. The Army medical officers treating repatriated prisoners have seen thousands of similar cases by this point in the war, have developed standard protocols for dealing with POW syndrome, and note in Book's file that he shows typical symptoms of extended captivity and combat stress. Returning to civilian life in 1945 means navigating a America that's celebrating victory, but doesn't particularly want to hear about war's details, that views veterans with appreciation, but also with a desire to move forward rather than dwelling on past traumas. Book returns to his family in St. Louis, accepts congratulations for his service, and discovers that nobody's particularly interested in hearing about Lanzerath Ridge or 12 hours of combat or 5 months in German POW camps. The cultural moment favors looking forward, building the post-war prosperity that will become the 1950s economic boom, not examining the psychological costs of combat or questioning why certain actions received recognition while others disappeared into bureaucratic files. He enrolls in college on the GI Bill, pursues a degree in education, builds a life that looks from the outside like successful reintegration, but that carries private burdens of memory and survivor's guilt. The official recognition that Book expects, medals, commendations, acknowledgement that his platoon's action had operational significance, never arrives. The Army's medal system, already overwhelmed by processing recommendations from millions of service members, appears to have lost or misfiled the paperwork related to Lanzerath. Battalion commanders who might have written recommendations were killed in subsequent fighting or scattered to different units after the battle. The chaos of the Ardennes Offensive disrupted normal administrative procedures, and actions that would normally receive immediate attention got lost in the larger crisis. By the time administrative order was restored, Lanzerath was one village among hundreds where Americans fought and died, and 18 men holding a crossroads didn't seem particularly remarkable compared to companies that held against regimental attacks or battalions that conducted fighting withdrawals under impossible conditions. The historical record initially treats Lanzerath as a footnote if it mentions the village at all. Early histories of the Battle of the Bulge focus on major engagements: Bastogne, St. Vith, the Malmedy Massacre, Piper's Drive westward, without examining the small unit actions that disrupted German timetables and prevented breakthrough. Stephen Ambrose's initial accounts barely mention Lanzerath, and when they do, the description suggests company-strength American forces held the position, not a single platoon. John Toland's Battle, the Story of the Bulge, published in 1959, gives Lanzerath more attention, but still doesn't identify Buck or his men by name, treating the action as an example of American small unit effectiveness, rather than a specific story of specific soldiers. The omission isn't deliberate erasure, so much as the inevitable selectivity of historical narrative. Every battle produces more stories than can be told, and the stories that get told are usually the ones with clear documentation, obvious drama, or convenient connection to larger strategic narratives. Book's private frustration with the lack of recognition grows over decades, compounded by watching other actions receive attention while Lanzerath remains obscure. He attends veterans' reunions, corresponds with other platoon members, maintains the bonds formed in combat, but none of them can quite understand why their action didn't receive the acknowledgement that similar actions earned for other units. The psychological impact is subtle but real, the feeling that your service doesn't matter unless it's officially recognized. That experiences that defined your life are somehow less valid because bureaucracy failed to document them properly. Some platoon members cope through silence, refusing to talk about the war and building lives that don't reference military service. Others cope through advocacy, writing letters to Army officials, contacting veterans organizations, trying to generate interest in a story that seems to matter to them, but to few others. The 1960s and 70s bring changing American attitudes toward military service and veterans, driven partly by the Vietnam War and partly by generational shifts in how Americans understand their history. The Greatest Generation narrative, the idea that World War II was a clear-cut moral crusade fought by heroes who deserve uncomplicated celebration, begins to coexist with more complex examinations of war's costs and consequences. This cultural shift doesn't initially help Buch or his platoon. If anything, the turn toward questioning military mythology makes telling their story feel like seeking glory for actions that anti-war activists might view skeptically. Buch, by this point, has spent decades as a high school teacher. A respectable middle-class life that doesn't center military service, and the idea of pushing for recognition feels increasingly like seeking attention rather than seeking justice. The psychological toll of unrecognized service manifests differently across the platoon. Some men develop what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares and flashbacks, and difficulty maintaining relationships. Though in the 1960s and 70s, these symptoms are often dismissed as personal weakness rather than recognized as service-connected disabilities. Others cope through compartmentalization, treating their war service as a closed chapter that doesn't connect to present life, building successful careers and families, while rarely discussing combat experiences even with those closest to them. A few struggle with substance abuse or depression, conditions that may or may not be connected to combat trauma, but that certainly aren't helped by the feeling that their service doesn't count because it wasn't officially documented. The statistical reality of military recognition provides context for Lanzerath's omission. Millions of Americans served in World War II. Hundreds of thousands saw combat. Thousands performed actions that, by objective standards, deserved medals but never received them because of administrative failures, lost paperwork, commanding officers killed before writing recommendations, or simple bureaucratic oversight. The Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star, all these decorations were awarded thousands of times during the war, but for every award actually presented, there were probably multiple actions that deserved recognition but never received it. Buch's platoon is unusual not because they didn't receive immediate recognition, that was common, but because the recognition took so long to arrive and required such extensive advocacy to achieve. The gradual fragmentation of the platoon through normal attrition of age and mortality adds urgency to the question of recognition. By the 1980s, several platoon members have died from natural causes, taking their memories and their experiences with them, making it increasingly difficult to compile the kind of comprehensive account that would support medal recommendations. The survivors face the prospect that recognition, if it comes at all, will come too late for many of those who deserve it, that their story will be acknowledged only after most of the participants are dead. This creates a bitter calculus. Fight for recognition now, while survivors can receive it, even though pushing for medals decades after the fact feels uncomfortable and potentially looks like seeking glory. Or accept that their action will remain largely forgotten, remembered by a dwindling circle of veterans and family members, but not acknowledged in the official historical record. 1981, Fort McNair, Washington, D.C. Colonel, retired John Eisenhower, son of the former Supreme Allied Commander and himself a military historian of growing reputation, sits in an archive reviewing after-action reports from the Battle of the Bulge. He's researching small unit actions for a book project, trying to understand how tactical resistance in the offensive's opening hours affected operational outcomes, and he keeps encountering references to Lanzerath Ridge that don't quite add up. The German reports describe encountering heavy resistance, suffering significant casualties, experiencing delays that disrupted the advance timeline. The American reports from the 99th Division are fragmentary, contradictory, suggesting everything from company-strength forces to isolated squads held the position. Eisenhower's historian instincts tell him there's a story here that hasn't been properly told, that the confusion in the documents reflects something interesting rather than just administrative chaos. The The detective work required to reconstruct the Lanzerath story reveals how easily military actions can disappear into bureaucratic gaps. The platoon was part of the intelligence and reconnaissance element of the 394th Infantry Regiment, which means their chain of command was complicated, reporting relationships were unclear, and administrative responsibility for writing after-action reports and recommending awards fell between organizational cracks. The battalion they nominally belonged to was scattered during the offensive's opening. Command posts were overrun. Officers who would normally document subordinate unit actions were killed or captured. The paperwork that did exist was often filed under incorrect unit designations, misidentified the number of soldiers involved, or credited the action to units that didn't participate. Reconstructing what actually happened requires cross-referencing German records with American reports, interviewing survivors, and accepting that some details are lost forever. Eisenhower's initial research leads him to a surprising conclusion. The defense of Lanzerath Ridge was conducted by a single platoon, 18 men, who held against battalion-plus-strength German forces for approximately 12 hours. The casualty exchange ratio, roughly 400 German casualties for 0 American deaths during the actual battle, suggests either that the Americans fought exceptionally well or that the circumstances favored defense to an unusual degree, probably both. He begins reaching out to veterans organizations, trying to locate survivors, and eventually makes contact with Lyle Book, now in his late 50s, still teaching high school in Missouri, still carrying memories of December 16th, 1944 that have never been properly acknowledged. The interview between Eisenhower and Book in 1983 represents the first time a professional military historian has asked detailed questions about Lanzerath, with the specific intention of documenting the action for historical record. Book describes the decision to stay rather than withdraw, the tactical advantages of the position, the ammunition constraints, the escalating German assaults, the final overrun and capture. Eisenhower takes notes, asks follow-up questions, and begins to understand why this particular action mattered operationally. The 12-hour delay imposed on Kampfgruppe, Piper cascaded through the German operational plan, affecting arrival times at Stavelot, compromising the entire timeline for reaching the Meuse River, contributing to the offensive's ultimate failure to achieve breakthrough. It's the kind of tactical action with operational consequences that military historians study as examples of how warfare actually works versus how it appears in planning documents. The German archival research provides crucial corroboration that American records alone can't supply. Documents from 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, captured after the war and eventually declassified, confirm the casualties taken at Lanzerath, the delays experienced, the frustration communicated to higher headquarters about unexpected resistance. A post-war interview with Colonel von Hofmann, conducted by U.S. Army historians in 1946, but filed away and largely forgotten, describes Lanzerath as one of the most difficult engagements his regiment experienced during the offensive's opening days. Von Hofmann specifically notes the quality of American defensive fire, the effectiveness of their positions, and his surprise upon learning after capturing the position that it was held by only 18 men. This German perspective provides the external validation that transforms Book's account from personal memory to documented history. Gerald Astor, a journalist and military historian, picks up the story in the early 1990s while researching American small unit actions during World War II. He tracks down additional Lanzerath survivors, interviews family members of soldiers who've since died, and begins compiling a comprehensive narrative that includes personal details the official records lack. Astor's interviews capture the human dimension of the action, the fear, the exhaustion, the moral weight of killing, the complicated emotions of survival when others died. One survivor describes vomiting after the first engagement, physically unable to process what he'd done. Another talks about nightmares that persisted for decades, dreams of German soldiers advancing through fog, of ammunition running out, of dying alone in a Belgian village whose name he couldn't pronounce. These testimonies don't change the tactical facts, but they provide emotional context that makes the story more than just casualty figures and timeline analysis. The formal campaign for recognition begins in the mid-1990s, when veterans advocates and military historians compile a comprehensive case file supporting medal recommendations for Buch and his platoon. The file includes German casualty reports, American after-action documents, survivor testimonies, and strategic analysis showing how the Lanzerath delay affected broader battle outcomes. The advocates argue that the action meets every criterion for Distinguished Service Cross or higher: extraordinary heroism against overwhelming odds, tactical success with strategic consequences, personal risk in circumstances where withdrawal would have been justified. The paperwork gets submitted to the Army's Awards Review Board, enters the bureaucratic process for evaluating historical medal recommendations, and disappears into the same administrative labyrinth that's been swallowing Lanzerath documentation for 50 years. The breakthrough comes in 2003 when Alex Kershaw, a British-American historian and author, begins research for what will become The Longest Winter, the first book-length treatment of the Lanzerath action. Kershaw's research benefits from everything previous historians compiled, but adds crucial elements: extensive interviews with surviving German soldiers who attacked Lanzerath, Belgian civilians who witnessed the battle, and newly declassified intelligence documents that provide strategic context. His book, published in 2003, brings the Lanzerath story to popular attention for the first time, generating media coverage that previous academic work couldn't achieve. The book becomes a bestseller, reaches audiences beyond military history enthusiasts, and creates public pressure that bureaucratic processes respond to more readily than quiet advocacy. The media attention generated by Kershaw's book forces the Army to reconsider medal recommendations that had been languishing in administrative review for years. Television interviews with Buch and surviving platoon members, newspaper articles describing the action, veterans organizations amplifying the story through their networks. All of this creates visibility that makes it embarrassing for the military to continue ignoring the case. The Army's position shifts from "we're reviewing the recommendations" to "new evidence has come to light," to eventually "we're proud to recognize these soldiers for their extraordinary service." The language carefully avoids admitting that the Army dropped the ball for 6 decades, frames the recognition as responding to new information rather than correcting old oversights. But the result is what the advocates wanted: formal acknowledgement that the Lanzerath defense deserves recognition. The validation of Buch's story through official recognition has implications beyond individual medals or personal satisfaction. It confirms that small unit actions can have operational consequences, that junior leaders making tactical decisions in chaos can affect strategic outcomes, that the friction and delay warfare actually produces matters as much as the clean operational plans headquarters staffs draw on maps. It demonstrates that American tactical competence at the small unit level in World War II was higher than some historical accounts suggest, that green troops under good leadership could perform exceptionally even in desperate circumstances. And perhaps most importantly for the historical record, it shows that battlefield effectiveness and official recognition don't always align, that bureaucracy can fail to document actions that nonetheless occurred and mattered. October the 23rd, 2003, Fort Myer, Virginia. Lyle Buch stands at attention in his dress uniform, 80 years old, shoulders straight despite the weight of age and memory, as a 2-star general reads the citation that accompanies the silver star being pinned to his chest. The ceremony takes place in a hall filled with family, fellow veterans, military officials, and journalists who've discovered this story of forgotten heroism and delayed recognition. Around him stand surviving members of his platoon, fewer than half the original 18 now living, each receiving their own awards for actions that occurred 59 years ago. The general's voice is formal, reading language that describes extraordinary heroism in military operations against an armed enemy, and gallant action in the face of overwhelming odds, words that sound simultaneously fitting and inadequate for what happened at Lanzerath Ridge on December 16, 1944. Buch's own reaction to the ceremony mixes satisfaction with something more complicated, bitterness tempered by gratitude, the awareness that recognition arriving 60 years late can never quite compensate for 60 years of feeling forgotten. When journalists ask him how it feels to finally receive the medal, his response becomes famous in veteran circles. "It's 58 years late, but we'll take it." The comment captures both the pleasure of vindication and the pain of delay, the understanding that this ceremony should have happened in 1945 or 1946, when all 18 members of the platoon were alive to receive recognition, when the parents and families who worried through the war could have witnessed official acknowledgement that their son's service mattered. Instead, the ceremony happens when half the platoon is dead from natural causes, when families gather to accept awards on behalf of fathers and grandfathers who never lived to see this validation. The medals themselves carry hierarchical weight that matters to military culture, even if it seems obscure to civilians. The Silver Star is the third highest award for valor in the U.S. military, below only the Medal of Honor and Distinguished Service Cross, recognizing heroism that's extraordinary, but not necessarily at the absolute apex of human courage. The decision to award Silver Stars rather than Distinguished Service Crosses reflects judgments about how the Lanzerath action compares to other World War II heroics. Whether holding a position for 12 hours against 50-to-1 odds reaches the threshold for the second highest award or merely the third highest. These distinctions matter to veterans who understand the medal hierarchy, who know that a DSC commands more respect than a Silver Star, who feel that if bureaucracy is going to take 60 years to recognize service, it should at least get the level of recognition right. The ceremony in 2003 represents only the first round of recognition, not the final accounting. Advocacy continues for upgraded awards, for acknowledging that the initial Silver Star recommendations undervalued the action's significance. The argument for upgrades focuses on both tactical and strategic dimensions. Tactically, the platoon achieved a casualty exchange ratio and held ground against numerical superiority that exceeds most actions that received Distinguished Service Crosses during World War II. Strategically, the 12-hour delay at Lanzerath affected Kampfgruppe Peiper's timeline in ways that contributed to the failure of the entire German offensive. Whether these arguments will convince military awards, review boards remains uncertain in 2003, but the advocates are persistent. The media attention is sustained, and the bureaucratic resistance to recognizing the action has already been broken by the initial awards. 2008 brings the upgrade that advocates sought. Book's Silver Star is replaced with the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, and several other platoon members receive upgraded medals as well. The ceremony acknowledges explicitly what the 2003 ceremony only implied. The defense of Lanzerath Ridge was not just heroic, but exceptionally heroic, not just tactically successful, but strategically consequential, worthy of recognition at the highest levels below the Medal of Honor. The DSC citation describes the action in language that emphasizes operational impact. Lieutenant Book's extraordinary heroism and decisive leadership resulted in the destruction of 5 enemy companies, denied the enemy a major axis of advance, and significantly delayed the German offensive during the critical opening phase of the Battle of the Bulge. It's official acknowledgement that this small unit action mattered to the larger battle. The contrast between the young soldiers who fought at Lanzerath and the elderly veterans who receive recognition reveals the temporal distance that war creates. Photographs from December 1944 show teenagers in oversized helmets, baby-faced kids trying to look tough for the camera, boys who probably still got carded buying cigarettes. Photographs from the 2003 and 2008 ceremonies show men in their 80s, faces lined by decades of life after war, bodies showing the wear of age. The same men, separated by 60 years and lifetimes of experience that have nothing to do with one day in Belgium. The younger veterans in the ceremony audience sometimes struggle to connect these elderly men with the actions described in the citations. To imagine these grandfathers as 19-year-olds holding a crossroads against German paratroopers, the absent friends haunt every ceremony, the platoon members who didn't survive to see recognition. The roll call includes men who died from natural causes in the decades between Lanzerath and acknowledgement, men who carried memories of that battle to graves without official recognition that their service mattered. Private Milosevic, the machine gunner whose 50 caliber fire did so much to hold the position, died in 1978 from a heart attack. Sergeant Slape, the steady presence who argued for withdrawal but stayed when the vote went the other way, died in 1992. Others died in the 50s, 60s, 70s, scattered across decades and states, taking their stories with them. Their families attend the ceremonies to accept posthumous awards, experiencing vicarious recognition that the veterans themselves never received. The bureaucratic explanation for the delay, newly discovered evidence, or recently declassified documents, rings hollow to anyone who examines the historical record closely. The evidence existed in archives for decades: German casualty reports from 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, American after-action documents from 99th Infantry Division, radio logs that documented the engagement in real time. The documents weren't classified in ways that would have prevented their use in medal recommendations. They weren't lost in fires or destroyed in accidents. They were simply filed away, misattributed, or overlooked by a bureaucratic system that had millions of service records to process and limited attention for small unit actions that didn't fit neat administrative categories. The newly discovered evidence narrative allows the Army to grant recognition without explicitly admitting that the system failed for 60 years. Book's post-war career as a high school teacher takes on additional resonance once the recognition arrives. He spent decades teaching American history, including World War II, without being able to tell his students that he'd participated in one of the war's more significant small unit actions. The irony of teaching the Battle of the Bulge without mentioning that you delayed the German offensive by half a day speaks to both Buck's humility and the frustration of unrecognized service. After 2003, he receives invitations to speak at schools and veterans events, opportunities to tell the Lanzerath story to audiences who have just learned it exists. These speaking engagements become a form of delayed vindication, the chance to educate people about an action that military history overlooked for decades. The psychological impact of recognition, even delayed recognition, shouldn't be underestimated. Multiple studies of combat veterans show that official acknowledgement of service affects mental health outcomes, provides validation that experiences were meaningful, helps integrate traumatic memories into personal narrative rather than leaving them as fragmentary intrusions. Buch and his surviving platoon members describe the medals as providing closure, confirming that their memories weren't exaggerated or self-important, that what felt significant to them actually was significant by objective military standards. The recognition doesn't erase 60 years of feeling forgotten, doesn't compensate for friends who died without acknowledgement, but it provides something that matters: official confirmation that their service and sacrifice counted. U.S. Army War College, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, present day. Military historians and strategic analysts gather to conduct war game simulations of the Battle of the Bulge, using modern analytical tools and historical hindsight to explore the question that haunts any close-run battle: how different could outcomes have been if key variables changed? The specific scenario they're gaming focuses on timing. What happens if Kampfgruppe Piper clears Lanzerath by 0900 hours on December the 16th instead of 2100 hours, gaining 12 hours on the actual historical timeline? The wargame uses computer modeling to simulate force movements, fuel consumption, allied response times, and all the other variables that determine whether an offensive succeeds or fails. The results, while necessarily speculative, suggest that small changes in timing could have produced significantly different outcomes. The 12-hour advantage scenario begins with Piper's armor reaching Stavelot by mid-afternoon, December the 16th, instead of early evening, December 17th. At mid-afternoon, American engineers haven't yet prepared bridge demolitions thoroughly. Defensive positions around the crossing are minimal, and the element of surprise that German forces enjoyed in the offensive's opening hours remains partially intact. Wargame simulations give Piper approximately 60 to 70% probability of seizing the Stavelot bridge intact in this scenario, compared to the near-zero probability he faced in historical reality, when engineers had hours to prepare and rig explosives. Capturing Stavelot bridge intact changes the entire operational geometry. Suddenly, Piper has a secure crossing over the Amblève River, a clear route west toward the Meuse, and momentum that hasn't been interrupted by bridge demolitions or organized American resistance. The fuel mathematics that doomed Kampfgruppe Piper in historical reality also shift in the 12-hour advantage scenario. If Piper captures the Billingen fuel depot 12 hours earlier and continues advancing without the delays that trapped him, his force potentially reaches secondary American fuel dumps before defenders can destroy them. Wargame analysts calculate that German forces needed approximately 400,000 gallons of fuel to reach the Meuse River bridges, and that major American dumps in the projected path of advance contained over 2 million gallons total. The historical Kampfgruppe Piper captured about 50,000 gallons at Billingen before being trapped and eventually abandoned all vehicles. The counterfactual Piper, maintaining momentum, might capture several 100,000 gallons across multiple dumps, enough to reach the Meuse and possibly cross it before Allied reinforcements organize. The race to Bastogne produces the most consequential differences in the counterfactual scenario. Historical timing had the 101st Airborne Division arriving at Bastogne approximately 2 to 4 hours before German encirclement could close completely, a narrow margin that allowed American forces to occupy the town and establish defenses. In the 12-hour advantage scenario, German forces advancing on schedule arrive at Bastogne before the airborne troops, finding either the town lightly held by scattered American units or possibly completely undefended. Wargame results give German forces roughly 80% probability of capturing Bastogne in the earlier timeline, compared to historical reality where they never captured it at all. Bastogne in German hands means control of the road network, freedom of maneuver throughout southern Ardennes, and elimination of the American strongpoint that historically anchored Allied defenses and forced German forces to commit resources to siege operations. The strategic implications of German forces reaching the Meuse River, which wargame scenarios suggest had roughly 50% probability in the 12-hour advantage case versus near zero probability historically, extend beyond immediate military considerations into political and diplomatic realms. A German breakthrough to the Meuse in late December 1944 would have created crisis at the highest levels of Allied command, forced emergency strategic decisions about whether to hold ground or preserve forces, potentially compromised the supply situation for Allied armies that depended on the port of Antwerp. The Churchill-Roosevelt relationship, already strained by disagreements about strategic priorities and post-war political arrangements, would have faced severe testing if a German offensive split Allied armies and threatened to roll back months of hard-won advances. The diplomatic consequences of a more successful German offensive involve speculation about topics that can never be known with certainty, but that historical analysis suggests mattered to decision-makers at the time. By late 1944, tensions between Western allies and the Soviet Union were already visible. Disagreements about Polish borders and Eastern European political arrangements, competing visions of post-war order. A German breakthrough that disrupted Allied operations and imposed a temporary operational pause might have affected the timing of final offensives into Germany, possibly allowing Soviet forces to advance further west before Germany surrendered, potentially altering the post-war map of Europe. Whether these potential consequences would have actually materialized depends on variables that wargaming can't capture. Individual decisions by political leaders under pressure, diplomatic negotiations under crisis conditions, the psychological impact of seeming setback on Allied public opinion. The weather variable introduces another layer of counterfactual complexity. German planning depended on low clouds and poor visibility to ground Allied aircraft during the offensive's critical opening phase, and historical weather cooperated for approximately 5 days before clearing on December the 23rd. The wargames that explore earlier German breakthrough also consider what happens if the weather had remained poor for an additional 3 to 5 days, extending the window when German forces could maneuver without fear of Allied air attack. Results suggest that extended poor weather combined with earlier breakthrough timing could have allowed German forces to reach the Meuse with substantially higher probability, possibly even establishing bridgeheads across the river before Allied air power returned to interdict further advances. The individual agency question, how much credit belongs to specific small unit actions versus larger systemic factors, remains philosophically challenging even after extensive wargaming analysis. The historians conducting these simulations acknowledge that Boak's platoon at Lanzerath was only one of dozens or hundreds of small unit actions that affected German timing during the offensive's opening days. Other villages held, other small groups of Americans fought delaying actions, other junior officers made decisions to stand rather than withdraw. Lanzerath receives historical attention, partly because of its eventual recognition, partly because of its location on Kampfgruppe Peiper's route, partly because the documentation exists to tell the story. How much credit should that specific action receive versus the accumulated effect of many small actions remains debatable. The systemic factors that doomed the German offensive, inadequate fuel, unrealistic logistics, insufficient strategic reserve, Allied material superiority, compromised operational security, weather that eventually favored Allied air power, would have existed regardless of what happened at Lanzerath. The counterfactual scenarios where Germany achieves greater initial success still ultimately fail when these systemic factors assert themselves, just at different timelines and geographic positions. Wargame results consistently show that even in scenarios where German forces reach the Meuse, they lack the fuel and ammunition to maintain bridgeheads against Allied counterattacks, eventually withdrawing or being destroyed when Allied material superiority reasserts itself. The question isn't whether Germany could have won the war through the Ardennes Offensive. Analysts agree that was never possible, but whether they could have achieved limited objectives with outsized strategic consequences. The modern military lessons drawn from Lanzerath focus on several enduring themes: the importance of small unit leadership in chaotic situations, the force multiplication available through superior defensive positioning, the operational consequences of tactical delay, and the requirement to prepare junior leaders to make strategic-level decisions under uncertainty. The Army War College uses Lanzerath as a case study in its infantry tactics courses, teaching students to analyze the tactical decisions Book made and consider alternatives. The battle appears in command and staff college curricula as an example of how friction and delay cascade through operational plans, how the gap between planning assumptions and battlefield reality produces outcomes that planners didn't anticipate. These pedagogical uses ensure that even 75 years after the battle, Lanzerath continues to inform how the American military trains leaders and thinks about warfare's unpredictable nature. August 15, 2012, somewhere in Middle America. The final reunion of Lanzerath Ridge veterans brings together 7 survivors, down from the original 18 who defended the position and fewer than attended previous reunions. They're in their late 80s now, moving slowly, dealing with the accumulated health problems that age brings, acutely aware that this is probably the last time they'll all gather together. The conversation mixes reminiscence with silence, stories they've told 100 times with thoughts too complicated for words, laughter at shared memories mixed with grief for absent friends. Someone mentions the cafe where they established their command post, wonders if it's still standing, whether Belgian civilians remember the Americans who fought there. Someone else talks about the cold, how it's strange that 70 years later, the most vivid memory is still the cold of that December day. They don't spend much time discussing heroics or tactical details. At this point in their lives, what matters is the connection, the shared experience, the understanding that only these men can fully appreciate what that day meant. Lyle Boak, now 90 years old, serves as unofficial spokesman for the group when journalists attend the reunion-seeking interviews. He's been telling this story for nearly a decade now, since the recognition in 2003 brought media attention. And he's developed a narrative that balances factual accuracy with emotional resonance. He talks about the decision to stay rather than withdraw, emphasizes that it was a collective decision rather than heroic individual leadership, describes the fear and exhaustion and the strange clarity that combat sometimes produces. He's asked repeatedly whether he realized at the time that they were affecting the larger battle, and his answer is always some version of, "We were 19 years old and scared to death. We weren't thinking about strategic implications. We were thinking about surviving the next 5 minutes." It's an answer that rings true to anyone who's experienced combat, the understanding that tactical decisions get made based on immediate circumstances rather than strategic calculus. The memorial at Lanzerath, erected in 2003 through the efforts of Belgian and German historical societies, stands at the crossroads where Book's platoon established their positions. The memorial is simple, a stone marker with bronze plaques listing the names of the 18 American defenders, a brief description of the action in English, French, and German, and a quote from Bulge about duty and sacrifice. Belgian villagers maintain the site, placing flowers on December 16th each year, teaching their children about the Americans who defended their town when they didn't have to. German visitors sometimes leave notes of respect, acknowledging the courage of soldiers who fought well, even while recognizing that both sides were serving national interests that produced terrible consequences. The memorial serves multiple purposes: honoring the dead, educating visitors about an obscure battle, and providing a physical location where memory becomes tangible rather than abstract. The academic treatment of Lanzerath has evolved from obscurity to incorporation into the standard narrative of the Battle of the Bulge, appearing now in most comprehensive histories of the offensive and in many introductory military history courses. The action serves as a useful teaching example for several reasons. It's well documented with both American and German sources. It demonstrates tactical principles clearly enough for students to understand, and it illustrates the gap between planning assumptions and battlefield reality that characterizes all military operations. Military academies use Lanzerath to teach about small unit leadership, particularly the decisions junior officers must make when communication breaks down and higher guidance isn't available. The case study format asks students to place themselves in Bulge's position on December 16, 1944, and decide what they would have done, a hypothetical that produces vigorous debate about duty, tactical soundness, and moral responsibility. December 16, 2019, marks the 75th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, and the last significant anniversary when Lanzerath survivors are alive to participate in commemorations. The ceremonies at the memorial attract hundreds of attendees: Belgian civilians, American military officials, German representatives, school groups, military historians, and a dwindling number of World War II veterans from various units. Bulge dies at age 94 on December 1st, 2019, 2 weeks before the anniversary he attended for so many years. His obituary in national newspapers describes him as the last commanding officer of the platoon that held Lanzerath Ridge, a simplified version of a complicated story, but accurate enough for readers who aren't specialists in World War II history. His funeral is attended by family, fellow veterans, and military officials who recognize that his death marks the end of living memory for an action that shaped history. The passing of the last Lanzerath veterans, which will likely occur within the next few years as men in their late 90s and early hundreds reach the end of natural lifespans, raises questions about how battles are remembered when no living participants remain. The transition from living memory to historical memory changes how events are understood. Stories become fixed rather than subject to correction by people who were there. Commemorations become more formal and less personal. The human dimension of combat risks being reduced to dates and tactical details. The challenge for historians and educators is preserving the complexity of the Lanzerath story: the fear, the courage, the moral ambiguity of killing, the randomness of survival, after the men who experience those things are no longer alive to provide personal testimony. The broader lessons that Lanzerath teaches extend beyond military tactics to questions about human behavior under extreme stress, about leadership in chaos, about the gap between what we think we'll do in crisis versus what we actually do when crisis arrives. The 18 men who defended that crossroads weren't superhuman or specially selected for their courage. They were average Americans, some barely out of high school, thrown into a situation that tested them beyond anything training prepared them for. The fact that they performed effectively, that they held ground against overwhelming odds, inflicted significant casualties, delayed a major German offensive, doesn't mean they were heroes in some Hollywood sense. It means they were normal people who discovered they could do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it, which is perhaps a more useful lesson than celebrating exceptional individuals who might have been different from the rest of us. The counterfactual questions that Lanzerath raises about how history might have changed if those 18 men had withdrawn as ordered, if Piper had broken through on schedule, if the German offensive had achieved breakthrough, ultimately can't be answered with certainty. History happened the way it happened, but the questions serve a purpose beyond satisfying curiosity. They remind us that outcomes we treat as inevitable were actually contingent, that individual decisions in chaotic circumstances can cascade into strategic consequences. that the space between success and failure in warfare is often much narrower than retrospective analysis suggests. The men who held Lanzerath didn't know they were affecting the larger battle, didn't realize their tactical decision would matter strategically, couldn't anticipate that their action would eventually receive recognition after 6 decades of obscurity. They made a choice based on immediate circumstances and their own sense of duty, and that choice rippled through events in ways they never intended or understood. The physical landscape of Lanzerath has changed in the 75 years since the battle. The cafe where Bulge established his command post was demolished and rebuilt. The fields where Germans advanced have been developed. The road network has been modernized. But walking the ground today, it's still possible to understand the tactical situation Bulge faced. The elevation advantage the Americans held, the fields of fire that made the crossroads defensible, the terrain that channeled German forces into kill zones. Military history enthusiasts make pilgrimages to Lanzerath, stand at the memorial, pace off distances. Try to imagine what it was like to be 19 years old and facing a German army. These visits keep the memory alive beyond academic history, transform abstract knowledge about battle into embodied understanding of place and circumstance. The final assessment of Lanzerath's significance requires balancing specificity with context, acknowledging both the exceptional nature of this particular action and the pattern it represents. Hundreds or thousands of small unit actions during World War II affected operational outcomes in ways that didn't receive recognition or historical attention. Bulge's platoon is remarkable partly because we know their story, because advocates fought for recognition, because documentation exists to support comprehensive analysis. But for every Lanzerath that gets remembered, there are probably dozens of similar actions that disappeared into history's footnotes or never got documented at all. The lesson isn't that Lanzerath was uniquely important, though it was important, but that warfare produces these moments of contingency where small groups of people make decisions that affect outcomes beyond their understanding or intention, and that recognizing these moments helps us understand how history actually happens versus how it looks in retrospective analysis that makes outcomes seem inevitable. The legacy of Lanzerath Ridge ultimately transcends the specific tactical details of one engagement on December 16, 1944. It speaks to themes that resonate across military history and human experience: the courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, the importance of leadership when chaos overwhelms planning, the ripple effects of decisions made under pressure, the persistence of memory even when official recognition is delayed or denied. The 18 men who defended that crossroads didn't think of themselves as making history. They were trying to survive, doing their duty as they understood it, making the best decisions they could with limited information and no time for reflection. That they succeeded, that their action mattered, that their story eventually got told. These outcomes weren't guaranteed or inevitable. They were the product of competence, courage, and considerable luck. But they demonstrate something important about warfare and human nature: that individuals matter, that tactical decisions have strategic consequences, and that the gap between victory and defeat, between recognition and obscurity, between life and death, is often far narrower than we'd like to believe.